At the far end of the chamber, a massive statue of what could only be Salazar Slytherin himself gazed down with stone eyes that seemed to see everything. And at the base of the statue, small and still and heartbreakingly fragile, lay Ginny Weasley. Neville ran to her, dropping to his knees beside the unconscious girl and pressing his fingers to her throat, searching desperately for a pulse. It was there, but barely, weak and irregular, as if her life was slowly draining away. "She won't wake," said a voice behind him, and Neville spun around to see a tall, dark-haired boy who looked perhaps 16 years old, wearing Hogwarts robes that seemed somehow old-fashioned. The boy was translucent, like a ghost, but there was something solid about his presence that made it clear he was not just a spirit. "Tom Riddle," Neville said quietly, recognition dawning as he remembered the diary they had found in Moaning Myrtle's bathroom. "You're Tom Riddle." "I am," the boy replied with a smile that was both charming and utterly cold. "And you, of course, are the famous Neville Longbottom, the boy who lived. I've been so looking forward to meeting you." Neville's hand moved instinctively to his wand, but Riddle laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, I wouldn't bother with that," Riddle said conversationally. "You see, the more we talk, the more solid I become, and the weaker little Ginny gets. She's been pouring her soul into my diary all year, telling me all her secrets, her fears, her deepest thoughts, and I've been drinking them up, growing stronger." "You're possessing her," Neville said, understanding flooding through him. "Making her open the chamber, control the basilisk." "Very good," Riddle applauded mockingly. "Yes, I've been using her to do my bidding. Such a sweet, trusting child. So eager to have someone who understood her loneliness, who cared about her problems. It was almost too easy." Neville felt sick as he realized the scope of the manipulation. Ginny Weasley, barely 11 years old, had been used as a weapon against her own school, her own friends. The guilt and horror she must have felt as she realized what she was being forced to do. "She tried to get rid of the diary," Riddle continued, clearly enjoying Neville's distress. "Threw it away when she realized what was happening. But someone put it back in her books, didn't they? Someone who wanted the terror to continue." "Why?" Neville asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. "Because I needed her to open the chamber one final time. I needed her to lure you here, Neville Longbottom, the boy who destroyed my future self, who ruined my carefully laid plans for immortality." Riddle's form was becoming more solid now, his translucent appearance giving way to something that looked almost alive. At the same time, Ginny's breathing was becoming shallower, her pulse weaker. "You see, I've been wanting to meet you for so long," Riddle said, circling around Neville like a predator stalking prey. "The infant who somehow survived the killing curse, the child whose mother's love proved stronger than the most powerful dark magic ever created." "My parents," Neville said quietly. "You killed my parents." "Ah, but I didn't, did I?" Riddle's smile was triumphant. "That was my older self, the wizard I was destined to become. But thanks to you, that future was cut short. Lord Voldemort died that night in your nursery, destroyed by something as simple and mundane as a mother's love." Neville felt his scar beginning to burn, a familiar pain that meant dark magic was close. "But you're here. Part of you survived. This memory, preserved in my diary when I was 16 years old. The closest thing to immortality I managed to achieve before you ruined everything." Riddle's voice was growing colder, more dangerous. "But that's about to change." "What do you mean?" "I'm going to kill you, Neville Longbottom. Slowly, painfully, while I drain the last of this girl's life force to make myself completely real again. And then I'm going to walk out of this chamber and finish what my older self started." Before Neville could respond, Riddle turned toward the massive statue of Salazar Slytherin and spoke in Parseltongue. The stone eyes of the statue began to glow, and slowly, with grinding sounds that echoed through the vast chamber. The statue's mouth began to open. What emerged from that opening was the most terrifying creature Neville had ever seen. The basilisk was easily 60 feet long, its scales gleaming like polished emeralds in the magical light, its body as thick as a tree trunk. But it was the eyes that truly terrified him, massive, yellow, and filled with ancient malevolence. Eyes that could kill with a single direct look. Neville threw himself sideways as the serpent struck, its massive head slamming into the stone floor where he had been standing a moment before. The impact sent cracks radiating through the ancient stones and filled the chamber with the sound of breaking rock. "Kill him," Riddle commanded in Parseltongue, his voice echoing strangely in the serpent tongue, but slowly. "I want to watch him suffer." Neville rolled desperately away from another strike, his mind racing as he tried to figure out how to fight a creature that could kill him with a glance. He kept his eyes fixed on the ground, using his peripheral vision to track the basilisk's movements, but he knew it was only a matter of time before the serpent cornered him. Then, from somewhere high above, came the sound of beating wings. Fawkes, Dumbledore's phoenix, descended into the chamber like a meteor of gold and crimson fire. The magnificent bird's song filled the space with haunting beauty that seemed to give Neville strength even as it enraged the basilisk. Phoenix song, Neville remembered from his reading, was known to give courage to the pure of heart and strike fear into the followers of dark magic. But more importantly, Fawkes had brought something with him. The sorting hat dropped from the phoenix's talons to land at Neville's feet, and from within its ancient folds a silver sword emerged, the blade of Godric Gryffindor himself, gleaming with rubies and inscribed with words that spoke of courage and determination. "A phoenix and a hat," Riddle laughed from across the chamber. "This is what Dumbledore sends to save you? His faith in you is touching, but ultimately useless." Neville grasped the sword's hilt, feeling power flow through the ancient weapon. But even armed with Gryffindor's blade, he was still facing a creature that outweighed him by thousands of pounds and could kill with a look. The basilisk struck again, and this time Neville wasn't quite fast enough. The serpent's massive head caught him a glancing blow that sent him tumbling across the chamber floor, the sword spinning away from his grasp. Pain lanced through his ribs, and he tasted blood in his mouth. As he struggled to regain his feet, Fawkes attacked the basilisk directly, diving at the creature's head with talons extended. The phoenix's claws found the serpent's eyes, digging deep furrows that sent the basilisk into a frenzy of pain and rage. Blinded, the creature could no longer kill with a glance, but it was still a 60-foot serpent with fangs like sword blades and the crushing strength to break every bone in Neville's body. Neville retrieved Gryffindor's sword and faced the enraged basilisk, knowing that he had perhaps one chance to end this fight before the creature's thrashing destroyed the entire chamber. He waited until the serpent's head was low, striking toward where it thought he was standing, then brought the ancient blade down with every ounce of strength he possessed. The sword pierced the roof of the basilisk's mouth and drove up into its brain, ending the creature's life instantly. But as the massive body collapsed, one of the serpent's fangs broke off in the wound, piercing Neville's arm and injecting him with venom that burned like liquid fire. "No!" Riddle screamed, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking as he realized his plan was falling apart. "You were supposed to die. You were supposed to be destroyed like your parents." Neville pulled the fang from his arm, ignoring the spreading numbness that told him the venom was already working its way through his system. He had perhaps minutes before the poison killed him, but there was still one thing he needed to do. Tom Riddle's diary lay beside Ginny's unconscious form, its black leather binding seeming to pulse with dark magic. Neville drove the basilisk fang into the diary's heart, and immediately the chamber filled with Tom Riddle's screams. "No, you don't understand what you're doing. That diary is my life, my soul." But even as Riddle's form began to fade, becoming translucent again, Neville felt the poison spreading through his body. His vision was growing dark, and he could feel his heartbeat slowing with each passing second. He collapsed beside Ginny, hoping that destroying the diary would be enough to save her life, even if it was too late to save his own. At least Harry would find them both, would be able to tell the others what had happened in the chamber. At least he had managed to stop Tom Riddle before the young Dark Lord could return to the world above. Then Fawkes was beside him, the phoenix's golden feathers warm against his skin as the magnificent bird leaned down to examine his wounds. Phoenix tears, Neville remembered dimly from his studies, had healing properties that were legendary throughout the magical world. The tears that fell from Fawkes's eyes onto Neville's wound burned at first, but then the fire became warmth, and the warmth became healing. The basilisk venom, deadly as it was, could not stand against the phoenix's tears. Within moments, Neville felt strength returning to his limbs and clarity returning to his mind. Ginny stirred beside him, her eyes fluttering open as Tom Riddle's hold on her life force finally broke completely. "Neville," she whispered, her voice weak but wonderfully alive. "What happened? Where am I?" "You're safe," Neville said, helping her sit up against the base of Slytherin's statue. "It's over. Tom Riddle is gone." It took nearly an hour for Harry to break through the collapsed tunnel, working frantically with his bare hands, and whatever magic he could manage to clear enough space to squeeze through the rubble. When he finally reached the chamber, expecting to find his friend dead or dying, he instead discovered Neville sitting calmly beside a conscious but weak Ginny Weasley, with the corpse of the basilisk stretched across the chamber floor. "You did it," Harry said, his voice thick with emotion, as he pulled his friend into a fierce embrace. "You actually killed it." "We did it," Neville corrected gently. "I couldn't have gotten this far without you, Harry, without knowing you were there, supporting me, believing in me." They helped Ginny to her feet and began the long journey back through the tunnels, Fawkes lighting their way with his golden plumage. Professor Lockhart, his memory completely gone, followed them with the docility of a young child, though Harry suspected his condition might be permanent. By the time they reached the surface, news of their success had already spread throughout the castle. Students lined the corridors, cheering and applauding as Neville passed, but Harry noticed that his friend seemed more embarrassed than pleased by the attention. "They're treating you like a hero again," Harry observed as they finally reached the hospital wing, where Madame Pomfrey immediately began fussing over all three of them. "I don't feel like a hero," Neville replied quietly. "I feel like someone who barely survived something terrible." "That's what makes you a hero," Ginny said softly, from the bed where the school nurse was checking her vital signs. "You were terrified, but you came anyway. You saved my life, even though it meant risking your own." Professor Dumbledore arrived a few minutes later, his blue eyes twinkling with something that looked like pride mixed with concern. The headmaster listened carefully as Neville recounted the events in the chamber, nodding gravely at the description of Tom Riddle and the diary that had contained a fragment of the Dark Lord's younger self. "A Horcrux," Dumbledore said quietly when Neville finished his account. "A piece of soul, preserved through the most terrible of dark magic. You have destroyed something very dangerous, Mr. Longbottom, and likely saved many lives in the process." "Sir," Neville said hesitantly, "Tom Riddle said that he was Voldemort's memory of himself at 16. Does that mean that there may be other fragments of his soul hidden elsewhere? I'm afraid that is a very real possibility." Dumbledore's expression was grave as he contemplated the implications. "But that is a concern for another day. For now, it is enough that this particular piece of darkness has been destroyed." The headmaster turned his attention to Harry, who had remained quietly supportive throughout Neville's recounting of the chamber events. "And you, Mr. Potter, showed remarkable loyalty and courage in accompanying your friend on such a dangerous mission. The bond between you two has proven stronger than even the most powerful dark magic." Harry felt heat rise in his cheeks at the praise, but also a deep satisfaction at the recognition of what he considered the most important aspect of his identity, not his magical abilities or his famous parents, but his unwavering friendship with Neville Longbottom. The rest of the school year passed in a blur of recovery and celebration. Ginny slowly regained her strength and confidence, though she remained quiet about her experiences with Tom Riddle's diary. The other petrified students were cured with mandrake draught, returning to consciousness with no memory of their attacks, but grateful to be alive. Professor Lockhart never recovered his memory, eventually leaving Hogwarts to take up residence in a long-term care facility for victims of magical accidents. His replacement was a kindly older witch who actually knew something about defense against the dark arts and treated Neville like a student rather than a celebrity. At the end-of-year feast, Gryffindor House won the House Cup by a comfortable margin, their victory secured by the points awarded for Neville's defeat of the Basilisk and Harry's loyal support throughout the crisis. But even as their housemates celebrated, Harry noticed that Neville seemed subdued, almost melancholy despite their success. "What's wrong?" Harry asked as they sat together at the Gryffindor table, watching their fellow students enjoy the victory feast. "I keep thinking about Tom Riddle," Neville said quietly. "About how he was once just a student here, like us. What turned him into Voldemort? What made him choose darkness over everything else?" It was a profound question from someone who had now faced the Dark Lord's essence twice and survived both encounters. Harry could see that his friend was struggling with concepts that went beyond simple good and evil, wrestling with the complexity of human nature and the choices that define who we become. "I don't know," Harry said honestly, "but I know that you'll never become anything like him. You've had the same kinds of pressures, the same temptations to use your power for selfish reasons, and you've chosen differently every time. How can you be so sure?" "Because I know you," Harry replied simply. "I've seen you face darkness and choose light, face despair and choose hope. I've seen you risk your life to save people who had turned against you, who suspected you of being the very evil you were fighting." Neville was quiet for a long moment, considering his friend's words. "Thank you," he said finally, "for believing in me, for standing by me even when it would have been easier to distance yourself from all the suspicion and danger." "Thank you for letting me," Harry replied, echoing the words they had exchanged after their first year. "Thank you for being the kind of person worth standing by." As the feast wound down and students began making their way back to their dormitories for the last time that year, Harry reflected on everything they had experienced together. 2 years at Hogwarts, 2 major crises faced and overcome, and their friendship had only grown stronger through each challenge. He looked at Neville, who was saying goodnight to Ginny with the gentle kindness that characterized all his interactions with people who needed support, and felt a deep sense of gratitude for the chance encounter that had brought them together on the Hogwarts Express. Tomorrow they would return to their separate summer homes, but in a few months they would be back at Hogwarts for their 3rd year. Whatever challenges awaited them, whatever darkness might threaten their school or their world, they would face it together. The boy who lived and his most loyal friend united against whatever forces might try to tear them apart. It was, Harry thought, as he watched Neville help a still weak Ginny to her feet, a pretty good foundation for whatever adventures lay ahead. And deep in his heart, he knew that their greatest adventures were still to come. The summer before their 3rd year passed differently than the previous 2, marked by a sense of growing maturity that came from having faced real darkness and survived it twice. Harry spent long, lazy afternoons with his parents, appreciating the simple pleasure of a family that remained intact and whole, while letters from Neville suggested that Augusta Longbottom was beginning to treat her grandson less like a symbol and more like the young man he was becoming. "Gran actually asked for my opinion about the greenhouse renovations," Neville wrote in one letter that made Harry smile. "She said my expertise with magical plants had impressed Professor Sprout enough that my input might be valuable. It's the first time she's ever acknowledged that I might know something she doesn't. The contentment of summer was shattered on the last day of August, when the Daily Prophet arrived with headlines that made Harry's blood run cold. Sirius Black escapes from Azkaban Mass. Murderer on the loose boy who lived in danger. The article that followed painted a picture of a wizard so dangerous that even the Dementors of Azkaban prison had been unable to hold him. Sirius Black, convicted of murdering 13 people with a single curse and betraying James and Lily Potter to Voldemort, had somehow escaped from the most secure, magical prison in the world. Harry's parents found him at the breakfast table, staring at the newspaper with a mixture of horror and confusion. "Harry." Lily's voice was gentle but concerned. "What's wrong?" "Sirius Black," Harry said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's escaped from Azkaban. The paper says he might be coming after Neville." The silence that followed was heavy with implications none of them wanted to voice. James sat down heavily across from his son, his face pale as he processed the news. "Sirius is my best friend," James said carefully. "Or was. Before the war. Before he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. He betrayed the Longbottoms," Harry said, reading from the article. "Told you know who where to find them. The paper says he was their secret keeper, that he sold them out for power or money or something." Lily's face was tight with pain and old grief. "We thought we knew him. We all did. He was practically family, Harry. Your father trusted him with his life, and Frank and Alice trusted him with theirs." The betrayal implicit in those words was staggering. Harry tried to imagine what it would feel like to discover that someone he trusted completely had been working for the enemy all along, had been responsible for the deaths of people he cared about. "What does this mean for Neville?" Harry asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. "It means," James said heavily, "that we need to get you both to Hogwarts as safely as possible. And it means that this year is going to be very different from the previous two." The journey to King's Cross Station felt like a military operation. James and Lily accompanied Harry to the platform, their wands subtly drawn and their eyes constantly scanning the crowd for threats. Other families seemed equally tense, parents holding their children closer than usual and speaking in hushed, worried tones. Harry found Neville near the train, surrounded by what looked like half a dozen Aurors, in addition to Augusta Longbottom. His friend's face was pale but determined, and when their eyes met across the crowded platform, Neville managed a small smile that didn't quite hide his anxiety. "Harry!" Neville pushed through the protective cordon to reach his friend, and for a moment the two boys stood together in the eye of a storm of adult worry and fear. "Are you all right?" Harry asked quietly. "I'm fine," Neville replied, though Harry could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his eyes kept darting toward the shadowy corners of the station. "Just tired of everyone treating me like I'm made of glass." They boarded the Hogwarts Express with more supervision than usual, but once the train was moving and the protective wards were active, the adults seemed to relax slightly. Harry and Neville found an empty compartment and settled in for what they hoped would be a peaceful journey. They were joined shortly afterward by Hermione, whose arms were full of books and whose schedule, according to the parchment that fell from her bag, appeared to be physically impossible. "How are you taking 12 subjects?" Harry asked, examining the timetable with confusion. "Some of these classes are at the same time." "I have special permission," Hermione said evasively, stuffing the schedule back into her bag. "Professor McGonagall arranged it. I'll manage somehow." Before either boy could press for more details, the train began to slow with a grinding of brakes that seemed premature, given how far they were from Hogwarts. Through the windows, Harry could see that they were stopping in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dark countryside and storm clouds that hadn't been there moments before. "What's happening?" Neville asked, pressing his face to the glass. "Why are we stopping?" The temperature in their compartment began to drop rapidly, their breath becoming visible as frost formed on the windows. Outside, strange figures were gliding toward the train, tall, cloaked beings that seemed to drain the warmth and light from everything around them. "Dementors," Hermione whispered, her face going white with terror. "They're searching the train." The door to their compartment slid open, and one of the creatures entered, its hooded face turning toward each of them in turn, before focusing entirely on Neville. The effect was immediate and devastating. Neville's face went slack with despair, his eyes rolling back as the Dementor began to feed on his happiness and hope. Harry felt his own strength draining away as the creature's presence filled the compartment with an aura of hopelessness that threatened to overwhelm him entirely. But through the growing darkness, he could hear something that made his blood run cold. The sound of a woman screaming, then a man's voice pleading, then the terrible silence that followed. Neville was reliving his parents' deaths, experiencing memories that had been buried too deep for conscious recall, but were now being pulled to the surface by the Dementor's hunger. "Get away from him!" Harry shouted, struggling to his feet despite the weakness that filled his limbs. He pointed his wand at the creature, trying to remember anything he'd read about fighting Dementors. "Expecto Patronum." The spell emerged weakly, producing only a faint mist that did nothing to deter the creature. But the interruption was enough to break the Dementor's focus, and a moment later, the compartment door burst open to reveal a shabby man in patched robes, his wand already raised. "Expecto Patronum," the man said firmly, and a brilliant silver wolf leaped from his wand to drive the Dementor from the compartment. The creature fled with what sounded like a hiss of frustration, and immediately the warmth began to return to the air. Neville collapsed back into his seat, his face grey and his entire body shaking with reaction. The man who had saved them knelt beside him, offering a piece of chocolate with gentle concern. "Here," the man said softly. "Eat this. It will help." Harry studied their rescuer carefully. He was perhaps 40 years old, with greying brown hair and kind eyes that were marked by deep lines of weariness and old pain. His robes were patched and mended, but his wand work had been flawless, and there was something about his manner that suggested extensive experience with dark creatures. "Professor Lupin," the man said, introducing himself to their small group. "I'll be teaching defense against the dark arts this year. Are you all right?" Neville heard something, Hermione said quietly, her voice shaking slightly. "When the Dementor was here, he was listening to something terrible." Lupin's expression grew grave as he studied Neville, who was slowly eating the chocolate with trembling hands. "Dementors force us to relive our worst memories," he explained gently. "For someone who experienced trauma as an infant, the effect can be particularly severe." "I heard them," Neville whispered, his voice barely audible. "My parents. They were screaming and then they weren't." Harry felt something crack in his chest at the pain in his friend's voice. Neville had never remembered his parents' deaths before, had grown up with only second-hand accounts of what had happened that night. To experience those memories for the first time through a Dementor's torture was unimaginably cruel. "I'm sorry," Lupin said, and Harry could hear genuine regret in the professor's voice. "The Dementors weren't supposed to board the train. They're here to search for Sirius Black, but they have strict instructions not to interfere with students." "They were looking for him," Harry said, understanding flooding through him. "The Dementor came straight to Neville. They think he's the most likely target." "Unfortunately, yes," Lupin admitted. "Black's escape has everyone on edge, and the Ministry is taking no chances with your safety." The rest of the journey passed quietly, with Professor Lupin remaining in their compartment to ensure no further Dementor encounters occurred. Harry found himself studying the new defense teacher carefully, noting the way Lupin's eyes kept drifting to Neville, with an expression that seemed to mix protectiveness with something that might have been guilt. When they finally reached Hogwarts, the Great Hall buzzed with nervous energy as students shared stories of the Dementor search. At the high table, Dumbledore's expression was graver than Harry had ever seen it, and even the other teachers seemed subdued by the reminder of the danger that lurked beyond the castle walls. "Before we begin the feast," Dumbledore announced once all the students were seated. "I must inform you of certain security measures that will be in effect this year. The castle grounds are being patrolled by Dementors from Azkaban Prison, placed here by the Ministry of Magic for your protection." A murmur of unease rippled through the hall. Most students had heard stories about Dementors, but few had ever encountered them directly. "The Dementors will remain at their posts until Sirius Black is captured," Dumbledore continued. "However, I must warn you that Dementors are not discriminating in their feeding. They will affect anyone who approaches them, so I strongly advise you to give them no reason to harm you." His blue eyes seemed to find Neville across the crowded hall. "In particular, I urge you to avoid any behavior that might be mistaken for an attempt to leave the castle grounds without permission." The message was clear, and Harry saw Neville's shoulders tense with the weight of yet another restriction on his freedom. The boy who lived was effectively under house arrest, surrounded by creatures that could drain his soul if they decided he was a threat. Over the following weeks, the presence of the Dementors cast a shadow over castle life that went far beyond their physical presence. Students moved in groups, avoiding the windows that looked out toward the grounds where the creatures glided between the trees like harbingers of despair. Even the ghosts seemed subdued, and the paintings whispered among themselves about the darkness that had settled over Hogwarts. For Neville, the situation was particularly difficult. The Dementors seemed drawn to him in a way that made it impossible to ignore their presence. Even when they weren't visible, their proximity affected him more severely than it did other students, leaving him pale and exhausted after even brief exposures. It was Professor Lupin who offered a solution. "I'd like to teach you both how to produce a Patronus," he said, during one of their Defense Against the Dark Arts lessons, addressing Harry and Neville directly while the rest of the class worked on simpler defensive spells. "It's advanced magic, well beyond what's typically taught to third years, but given the circumstances—" "What's a Patronus?" Neville asked, though his voice carried more curiosity than hope. "A guardian," Lupin explained. "A projection of positive emotion that can drive away Dementors and other creatures of darkness. The incantation is Expecto Patronum, but the real power comes from focusing on a truly happy memory." Harry thought immediately of his friendship with Neville, of the moment on the train when they had first chosen each other over easier paths. But when he looked at his friend, he saw doubt and something that looked like despair. "I don't know if I have any memories happy enough," Neville said quietly. "Everything good in my life is shadowed by what I've lost." Lupin's expression softened with understanding, and something that might have been personal experience. "Happiness can be found even in the darkest of times," he said gently, "if one only remembers to turn on the light." The Patronus lessons took place in an empty classroom after regular hours, with Harry and Neville working together to master the complex magic required to produce a corporeal guardian. Harry's Patronus came first, a magnificent stag that bounded around the room with silver fire, clearly inherited from his father's magical signature. Neville's progress was slower and more painful. His first attempts produced only wisps of silver mist, and Harry could see the frustration building in his friend's face with each failed casting. "Try focusing on something specific," Lupin suggested during one particularly difficult session. "Not just a general feeling of happiness, but a moment when you felt truly, completely content." Neville closed his eyes, his face screwed up in concentration. When he cast the spell again, the silver mist took shape. A bear, massive and protective, that stood between them and the practice boggart that Lupin was using to simulate Dementor presence. "A bear," Lupin said with something like surprise. "Interesting. Bears represent protective strength, the willingness to defend others even at great personal cost." Harry felt a surge of pride in his friend's choice of Patronus. It was perfectly suited to Neville's character, gentle and nurturing most of the time, but fiercely protective when those he cared about were threatened. Their Patronus lessons were interrupted in October by news that brought the danger closer to home. Sirius Black had been sighted near Hogsmeade, and the security around the castle was increased to the point where even the teachers seemed nervous. "He's getting closer," Hermione observed during one of their study sessions in the library. "Whatever he wants from Neville, he's determined to get it." "But what could he want?" Harry asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. Neville was just a baby when Black betrayed his parents. There's nothing he could tell him that would be worth this much risk. Neville, who had been quietly reading a herbology text, looked up with an expression that was older and more thoughtful than his 13 years should have allowed. "Maybe it's not about information," he said slowly. "Maybe it's about finishing what Voldemort started." The words hung in the air between them like a curse. The idea that Sirius Black might be trying to complete his former master's work by killing the boy who had destroyed him was both logical and terrifying. Their first Hogsmeade visit was scheduled for the following weekend, but Professor McGonagall made it clear that Neville would not be permitted to join the other third years on their trip to the village. "I'm sorry, Mr. Longbottom," she said with genuine regret, "but the risk is simply too great. We cannot allow you to leave the castle grounds while Black is at large." Harry immediately volunteered to remain at Hogwarts as well, despite Neville's protests that he should go and enjoy himself. The idea of leaving his friend alone in the castle while everyone else was having fun in the village was unbearable. "You don't have to stay because of me," Neville said, as they watched their classmates prepare for the trip with obvious excitement. "I'm not staying because of you," Harry replied. "I'm staying with you. There's a difference." They spent the day exploring parts of the castle they had never visited before, using Harry's father's invisibility cloak to avoid the increased patrols and security measures that had been put in place. It was during one of these explorations that they overheard a conversation that changed everything. Hidden beneath the cloak in an alcove near the Three Broomsticks Floo connection, they listened as Professor McGonagall spoke with Cornelius Fudge, the Minister for Magic, and Madame Rosmerta, the pub's owner. 12 years he's been in Azkaban," Fudge was saying, his voice heavy with old sadness. 12 years, and not a day goes by that I don't regret we couldn't save Frank and Alice Longbottom from his betrayal. "To think we all trusted him," McGonagall replied, her usually controlled voice tight with emotion. James and Lily Potter included. If Sirius hadn't convinced them to make him secret keeper instead of Lupin. Harry felt Neville go rigid beside him, and he had to resist the urge to reach out and offer comfort that might give away their presence. "Nasty business," Rosmerta said with a shudder. And to think he was the Longbottoms' friend. Their best friend, some said. "More than a friend," Fudge corrected grimly. "Practically family. Frank and Sirius were like brothers, and Alice, well, there were those who thought Sirius might have married Alice himself if Frank hadn't proposed first." The revelation hit Harry like a physical blow. Sirius Black hadn't just betrayed strangers or distant allies, he had betrayed people who loved him, people who had trusted him with their lives and their secrets. "What I don't understand," Rosmerta continued, "is why he's fixated on the boy now. Young Neville Longbottom never did anything to him." "Unfinished business," Fudge said darkly. "Black was Voldemort's most devoted follower, they say. With his master destroyed, perhaps he sees killing the boy who lived as the only way to honor that loyalty." They listened in horrified silence as the adults discussed Black's escape and the manhunt that had followed, painting a picture of a wizard so consumed by dark magic and fanatical devotion that he had spent 12 years in Azkaban without losing his determination for revenge. When they finally returned to the castle, both boys were quiet and thoughtful, processing the implications of what they had learned. "He loved them," Neville said, as they sat in the empty common room, staring into the fire. "My parents trusted him, cared about him, and he sold them to Voldemort anyway." Harry could hear the pain in his friend's voice, and he understood that this revelation was in some ways worse than learning about the betrayal from strangers. The idea that his parents had been murdered by someone they loved made their deaths even more tragic. People aren't always who we think they are, Harry said quietly, thinking of Tom Riddle and the charming student who had become Lord Voldemort. Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who can hurt us most. November brought the first Quidditch match of the season, with Gryffindor playing against Hufflepuff, in conditions that were miserable even by Scottish standards. Rain pelted the pitch in driving sheets, and the wind was strong enough to make flying dangerous for anyone except the most experienced players. Harry had been looking forward to the match for weeks, partly because he genuinely loved playing Seeker, but mostly because it would give Neville something to enjoy after months of living under the shadow of Sirius Black's threat. The match was going well for Gryffindor when disaster struck. Through the rain and wind, Harry spotted what looked like a large black dog sitting in the stands, its eyes fixed on the pitch with unnatural intensity. But before he could process the significance of what he was seeing, the temperature dropped precipitously, and Dementors began gliding onto the field. The effect on the players was immediate and devastating. Several Hufflepuff chasers fell from their brooms as the creature's presence overwhelmed them with despair, and Harry felt his own strength draining away as childhood terrors began to surface in his mind. But it was Neville's reaction that truly terrified him. In the stands, his friend had collapsed, his body convulsing as the Dementor's proximity forced him to relive not just his parents' deaths, but every moment of fear and loss he had ever experienced. Harry raised his wand, shouting the incantation that Professor Lupin had taught them. "Expecto Patronum!" His silver stag burst from his wand with more power than he had ever managed before, galloping around the Quidditch pitch and driving the Dementors back toward the castle boundaries. But even as the creatures retreated, Harry was falling, his concentration broken by the sight of Neville's motionless form in the stands. He woke up 3 days later in the hospital wing, with Madame Pomfrey fussing over him and his friends clustered around his bed with expressions of relief and concern. "How's Neville?" were the first words out of his mouth, and the hesitation in their faces told him everything he needed to know. "He's alive," Hermione said carefully, "but the Dementors affected him more severely than anyone expected. He's been unconscious since the match." Harry struggled to sit up, ignoring the matron's protests. In the bed next to his, Neville lay frighteningly still, his face pale and his breathing shallow. "The Dementors were trying to kiss him," Professor Lupin said quietly from the foot of Harry's bed. "If your Patronus hadn't driven them away when it did—" The implications of that statement made Harry feel sick. The Dementor's kiss was a fate worse than death, leaving the victim alive but soulless, an empty shell that breathed and moved, but was no longer truly human. "Why?" Harry asked desperately. Why were they so focused on him? Lupin's expression was troubled, and he seemed to be wrestling with some internal conflict. "Dementors are drawn to strong emotions," he said finally. "Pain, fear, despair. They feed on these things. Neville has experienced more trauma than most people twice his age." It was a reasonable explanation, but Harry sensed there was more to it than the professor was saying. There had been something deliberate about the way the Dementors had targeted Neville, something that went beyond their usual indiscriminate feeding. Neville woke up 6 days later, but he was changed by the experience in ways that went deeper than physical exhaustion. He spoke less, smiled rarely, and seemed to carry a weight of sorrow that made him appear older than his 13 years. "I remember more now," he told Harry during one of their quiet conversations in the hospital wing. "Not just my parents' deaths, but other things. Being dropped by Uncle Algy to see if I was magical. The disappointment on Gran's face when my magic was late to appear. All the times people looked at me and saw the boy who lived instead of just Neville." Harry wanted to offer comfort, but he also understood that his friend needed to process these recovered memories in his own way. The Dementors had stripped away the protective barriers that had allowed Neville to function, despite his traumatic past, and rebuilding them would take time. It was while Neville was still recovering that Professor Snape took over their defense against the dark arts lessons, ostensibly because Lupin was ill. The Potions Master's first lesson was a brutal examination of werewolves that seemed designed to plant suspicions about their regular teacher. "Can anyone tell me the distinguishing characteristics of a werewolf?" Snape asked, his black eyes glittering with malicious satisfaction. Hermione's hand shot up, but Snape ignored her in favor of calling on other students who were clearly unprepared for the advanced topic. "The key difference," Snape said, when no one could provide a satisfactory answer, "is that werewolves are dangerous at all times, not just during the full moon. They form close attachments to potential victims, gaining their trust before striking." Harry felt unease prickle down his spine. The lecture felt less like education and more like character assassination, and he noticed that several students were glancing toward the empty defense classroom with new suspicion. "Professor Lupin has been nothing but helpful," Harry said, unable to keep quiet any longer. "He saved us from the Dementor on the train, and he's been teaching us to defend ourselves." "How touching," Snape sneered. "Tell me, Mr. Potter, what do you know about the company Professor Lupin kept during his school days?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Harry realized that Snape was trying to lead him toward some revelation about their defense teacher. But before he could respond, the bell rang, ending the lesson and leaving the students to file out with more questions than answers. The truth came out on the night of the full moon in May, when a series of events converged to create the most dangerous situation they had yet faced. It began with Hermione's revelation that she had been using a time-turner to attend multiple classes simultaneously, a secret that explained her impossible schedule and her apparent ability to be in several places at once. "The ministry gave it to me so I could take extra subjects," she explained, as they sat in the common room, the small golden device glinting in the firelight. "But Professor McGonagall made me promise to use it only for schoolwork." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a small, hyperactive owl that Harry recognized as belonging to Ron Weasley. The letter it carried was brief but urgent. "Black's in the castle. He was in my dormitory. Help." They found Ron in the hospital wing, his leg bandaged from an encounter with what he claimed was an enormous black dog that had dragged him into a passage beneath the Whomping Willow. But it was what he said next that made Harry's blood run cold. "He wasn't trying to hurt me," Ron said, his freckled face pale with shock. "The dog was trying to get to you, Neville. It kept looking at you, and when I got in the way, it grabbed me instead." The realization that Sirius Black had been in their dormitory, mere feet from where Neville slept, sent both boys into a state of alert panic. If Black could get past all of Hogwarts' security measures, then nowhere in the castle was truly safe. "We have to find him," Harry said, his protective instincts overriding his usual caution. "If he's still in the castle, we need to stop him before he gets another chance at Neville." "We?" Neville asked quietly. "Harry, this is about me. I should face him alone." "Like hell," Harry replied firmly. "We face everything together. That's how it's always been." They made their way carefully through the castle corridors, using Harry's invisibility cloak to avoid the increased patrols that were searching for the escaped prisoner. The Whomping Willow stood silhouetted against the full moon, its branches thrashing violently in what appeared to be an empty landscape. But as they approached, Harry could see the entrance to a tunnel that Ron must have been dragged through, and after a moment's hesitation, they squeezed inside. The tunnel led to what had once been a comfortable house, but was now a ruin of dust and neglect. Furniture lay overturned, wallpaper hung in strips from mouldy walls, and everything was covered in a thick layer of dust that spoke of years of abandonment. They found Ron in what might once have been a sitting room, his injured leg preventing him from moving far from where the black dog had deposited him. But he wasn't alone. A man sat in one of the broken chairs, his appearance so shocking that Harry barely recognized him as human. Sirius Black was gaunt to the point of emaciation, his long black hair hanging in matted tangles around a face that might have been handsome once, but was now marked by 12 years of torment and despair. His clothes were the ragged remains of Azkaban prison robes, and his eyes held a wildness that spoke of barely controlled madness. "Neville," Black said, his voice hoarse from disuse, but carrying an intensity that made both boys freeze in the doorway. "Neville Longbottom, you look so much like your mother." "Don't," Harry said sharply, stepping protectively in front of his friend. "Don't you dare talk about his parents." Black's attention shifted to Harry with something that might have been surprise. "Harry Potter, you're here too. Of course you are. Frank always said loyalty was the most important quality in a friend." "How dare you?" Neville said, his voice shaking with rage rather than fear. "How dare you speak about my father like you cared about him?" "Because I did care about him," Black replied desperately. "I loved Frank and Alice like family. They were everything to me, and I would never have betrayed them. Never!" "Liar!" Harry shouted, his wand pointed directly at Black's chest. "You were their secret keeper. You sold them to Voldemort." "I was never their secret keeper," Black said, his wild eyes fixed on Neville with desperate intensity. "We switched at the last minute. I convinced them to use Peter Pettigrew instead, told them it would be safer because no one would suspect him." "Peter Pettigrew is dead," Hermione said from the doorway, where she had appeared with her own wand drawn. "You killed him." "Peter Pettigrew is right here," Black snarled, lunging toward Ron so suddenly that everyone in the room jumped. Before anyone could react, he had grabbed something from Ron's robes, a fat brown rat that Harry recognized as Scabbers. "No!" Ron protested. "Leave Scabbers alone!" But Black was already pointing his wand at the struggling rat, his face twisted with 12 years of accumulated rage and betrayal. "Show yourself, Peter," he commanded. And suddenly the rat was growing, stretching, transforming into something that made Harry's world tilt sideways. Where Scabbers had been, a short, balding man now cowered on the floor, his watery eyes darting desperately around the room as if looking for an escape route. He was clearly terrified, but there was something calculating in his expression that suggested his fear was mixed with a kind of cunning desperation. "Sirius," the man whimpered. "You don't understand. I had no choice. He would have killed me." "So you killed Frank and Alice instead," Black roared, his carefully maintained control finally snapping. "You sold them to Voldemort like they were livestock." Harry felt the world spinning around him as he tried to process what he was seeing. Peter Pettigrew, the man who had supposedly been murdered by Sirius Black, was alive and had been living as Ron's pet rat for years. "You're Peter Pettigrew," Neville said quietly, staring at the cowering man with an expression of dawning horror. "You're the one who betrayed my parents." "I had no choice," Pettigrew repeated, his voice rising to a desperate whine. "You don't understand what it was like. He was so powerful, and I was weak. I just wanted to survive." "So you gave him everything," Black said, his voice deadly quiet now. "Their location, their routines, when they would be most vulnerable. You handed them to him like a gift." "They would have died anyway," Pettigrew protested. "At least this way, I lived. At least someone survived." The casual cruelty of those words, the complete absence of remorse or recognition of what he had done, was more shocking to Harry than any outright evil he had encountered. This was not the calculating malice of Tom Riddle or the fanatical devotion of the Death Eaters. This was simple, cowardly selfishness that had cost two good people their lives. Before anyone could stop him, Neville had raised his wand, pointing it directly at Pettigrew's heart. "You killed them," Neville said, his young voice carrying a weight of grief and rage that no 13-year-old should have to bear. "You murdered my parents for your own convenience." "Neville," Harry said gently, recognizing the dangerous edge in his friend's voice, "you don't want to do this. Not like this." "Don't I?" Neville's hand was shaking, but his aim remained steady. "He deserves to die. He deserves to suffer the way they suffered." "Yes, he does," Black agreed quietly. "But not by your hand, Neville. You're not a killer, and I won't let you become one because of him." The sound of footsteps in the tunnel below interrupted the tense standoff, and moments later, Professor Lupin appeared in the doorway, his face pale and drawn in the moonlight, streaming through the broken windows. "Sirius," Lupin said carefully, taking in the scene with experienced eyes. "What are you doing?" "What I should have done 12 years ago," Black replied without taking his attention off Pettigrew. "Exposing the truth about Peter." Lupin's attention shifted to the cowering man on the floor, and his expression went through a complex series of changes: surprise, recognition, and finally a cold fury that transformed his usually mild features into something almost frightening. "Hello, Peter," Lupin said quietly. "It's been a while." What followed was a conversation that filled in the gaps of a story that had defined Neville's entire life. The four friends who had attended Hogwarts together: James Potter, Sirius Black, Remus Lupin, and Peter Pettigrew. The secret of Lupin's lycanthropy and the illegal animagus transformations that had allowed his friends to accompany him during full moons. The betrayal that had torn their group apart and cost 2 of them their lives. "We trusted you," Lupin said to Pettigrew, his voice heavy with old pain. "We loved you like a brother, and you sold us all for the promise of power." "I was weak," Pettigrew repeated, as if weakness were an excuse for betrayal and murder. "You don't know what it was like, being the least of you. Always the slowest, the least talented, the most frightened." "So you decided to join the winning side," Black said with disgust, "even if it meant destroying everything we cared about." The conversation was interrupted by a change in the moonlight streaming through the windows. Professor Lupin's face, which had been pale but human, began to elongate and sprout hair. His fingernails grew into claws, and his mild brown eyes became wild and predatory. "The moon," Hermione breathed, understanding flooding her face with terror. "Professor Lupin forgot to take his wolfsbane potion." What followed was chaos. Lupin's transformation into his werewolf form was violent and terrible, his human consciousness disappearing beneath animal instincts that recognized no friends, only potential prey. Black immediately transformed into his animagus form, the large black dog that had been stalking the castle grounds, and threw himself at the werewolf to protect the students. In the confusion, Pettigrew grabbed Lupin's dropped wand and disappeared with a crack of disapparition, leaving behind only the echo of his cowardly escape. Harry found himself outside the shrieking shack, dragging an injured Neville away from the battle between the 2 transformed creatures. Behind them, the sounds of conflict grew fainter, as Black led the werewolf away from the students, sacrificing his own safety to protect them. They made it perhaps 100 yards before the Dementors found them. The creatures glided out of the darkness like harbingers of despair, drawn by the emotional turmoil and magical chaos that had erupted around the shrieking shack. There were dozens of them, far more than Harry had ever seen in one place, and their combined presence was overwhelming. Harry felt his strength drain away as the Dementors surrounded them, but it was Neville who collapsed first, his recent traumatic memories making him more vulnerable to their influence than ever before. "Expecto Patronum," Harry shouted, but his stag was weak and faded, unable to drive away so many creatures at once. One of the Dementors lowered its hood, revealing the gaping void where its face should have been, and began to lean toward Neville with the unmistakable intention of administering the kiss. Harry threw himself between the creature and his friend, knowing that he couldn't produce a Patronus strong enough to save them both, but unable to watch Neville's soul be destroyed. Then, from across the lake, came a brilliant silver light that drove the Dementors back like a miniature sun. Harry looked up to see a magnificent stag, not his own, but something more powerful and ancient, galloping across the water toward them. The Patronus dispersed the Dementors completely, sending them fleeing back toward the castle boundaries, with what sounded like screams of frustration. In the sudden silence that followed, Harry realized that Neville was unconscious beside him, and that Sirius Black, back in his human form, was lying motionless nearby. "We have to get help," Harry said desperately. But even as he spoke, he could hear voices approaching, Professor Dumbledore and other teachers, drawn by the magical disturbance. What happened next was a blur of explanations and accusations, with Professor Snape insisting that Black had somehow bewitched the students and demanding immediate punishment. Cornelius Fudge arrived with a squadron of aurors, and it quickly became clear that no one was interested in hearing the truth about Peter Pettigrew's betrayal. "Without Pettigrew, we have no proof," Dumbledore said quietly to Harry and Hermione, while the Ministry officials prepared to drag Sirius Black back to Azkaban. "And a man's word against the official record of the Ministry. There has to be something we can do," Harry said desperately. Dumbledore's blue eyes twinkled with something that might have been encouragement. "Perhaps. But you would need to be very careful, and you would need more time than is available." The hint was oblique but clear, and Harry looked at Hermione with sudden understanding. "The time turner," he said quietly. What followed was perhaps the most surreal experience of Harry's life. Using Hermione's time turner, they went back 3 hours, watching themselves live through the evening's events from a different perspective. But this time, they were able to intervene at crucial moments. Harry saved both himself and Neville from the Dementors by producing the powerful Patronus he had seen from across the lake, a stag that was strengthened by the knowledge that he had already succeeded once. More importantly, they were able to rescue Sirius Black from his prison in the castle tower, using Hermione's borrowed hippogriff to provide him with an escape route that would allow him to disappear before the Ministry could drag him back to Azkaban. "Thank you," Sirius said to both of them as he prepared to fly away into the night, "for believing the truth when no one else would, for giving me a chance to clear my name." "What will you do now?" Neville asked, his voice stronger than it had been since his encounter with the Dementors. "Hide," Sirius replied honestly. "Wait for another chance to prove what really happened. But I'll be watching, Neville. If you ever need me, I'll find a way to help." "You were their friend," Neville said suddenly. "Really their friend. You loved my parents." "I loved them like family," Sirius confirmed, tears glistening in his eyes. "And I failed them in the most important way possible. I convinced them to trust Peter instead of keeping the secret myself." "You were trying to protect them," Harry pointed out gently. "You couldn't have known what Peter would do." "That's what Frank would have said," Sirius replied with a sad smile. "He always believed the best of people, even when they didn't deserve it." As Sirius and the hippogriff disappeared into the night sky, Harry felt a complex mix of emotions. They had saved an innocent man from a terrible fate, but they had also learned truths that made Neville's childhood tragedy even more painful. The revelation that his parents had been betrayed by someone they loved had hit Neville harder than any of his previous encounters with the truth about his past. But it had also seemed to free him from some of the guilt and self-doubt that had plagued him since learning about his connection to Voldemort. "I'm not responsible for what happened to them," Neville said, as they made their way back to the castle in the pre-dawn light. "I couldn't have saved them, and their deaths weren't my fault." "No," Harry agreed. "They were the fault of people who chose evil over good, betrayal over loyalty. But their love for you, that's what saved you, and that's what's made you who you are." As the third year drew to a close, Harry reflected on everything they had learned and experienced together. The truth about Sirius Black had been painful, but ultimately liberating, freeing Neville from some of the burdens he had carried for so long. But more importantly, their friendship had proven strong enough to survive even the manipulation of time itself, their loyalty to each other transcending the normal boundaries of reality. Whatever challenges their fourth year might bring, Harry knew they would face them together, just as they always had. The boy who lived and his most loyal friend united against whatever darkness might threaten the people they cared about. And somewhere in the wider world, Peter Pettigrew remained free, carrying secrets that could change everything if they were ever brought to light. But that, Harry thought, as he watched the sunrise paint Hogwarts Castle in shades of gold and amber, was a problem for another day. The summer before their fourth year was supposed to be a celebration of sorts, an opportunity to attend the Quidditch World Cup with the Weasley family and experience the kind of magical spectacle that came around once in a generation. Harry had been looking forward to the trip for weeks, partly because he genuinely loved Quidditch, but mostly because it would give Neville a chance to simply be a normal teenager for once, enjoying something purely for pleasure rather than obligation. The Portkey journey to the campsite was chaotic but exhilarating, with Harry, Neville, and Hermione joining the entire Weasley clan for what promised to be the adventure of a lifetime. Even Augusta Longbottom had agreed to let her grandson attend, though not without a lengthy list of safety precautions and emergency contacts that made Harry grateful for his own parents' more relaxed approach to supervision. "This is incredible," Neville said, as they walked through the campsite toward their designated area, his eyes wide with wonder at the thousands of tents that stretched as far as the eye could see. "I've never seen so many wizards in one place." The match itself was everything Harry had hoped it would be, a display of flying skill and magical athleticism that left all of them hoarse from cheering and dizzy with excitement. Victor Crumb's performance as Seeker was particularly impressive, though Harry noticed that Neville seemed more interested in the tactical aspects of the game than in individual showmanship. "Did you see how the Bulgarian chasers created space for each other?" Neville asked, as they made their way back to their tent after Ireland's victory. "The way they used misdirection and coordinated movement rather than just raw speed." It was the kind of analytical observation that reminded Harry why his friend would make an excellent strategist if he ever chose to pursue a career in magical sport or military planning. Neville had always been better at seeing the bigger picture than focusing on individual performance, and Harry suspected that trait would serve him well in whatever challenges lay ahead. The celebration that followed the match was everything a group of teenagers could have hoped for. Fireworks that painted the sky in impossible colors, music from a dozen different magical cultures, and the kind of infectious joy that comes from sharing a perfect moment with thousands of other people. It was after midnight when everything went wrong. Harry woke to the sound of screaming and the orange glow of fires that had nothing to do with celebration. Outside their tent, chaos reigned as families fled in terror from hooded figures who moved through the campsite with methodical cruelty, destroying everything in their path and tormenting anyone unfortunate enough to cross their path. "Death Eaters," Mr. Weasley said grimly as he herded the younger members of their group together. "Get into the woods and stay hidden. Don't come out until we come for you." What followed was perhaps the most terrifying experience of Harry's life up to that point. Hiding in the darkness of the forest, listening to the screams and watching the distant fires, he felt more helpless than he ever had when facing direct danger. At least when confronting Voldemort or his servants directly, there was something they could do, some way to fight back. But this was different. This was random violence visited upon innocent people, and there was nothing a group of 14-year-olds could do to stop it. Neville was handling the situation even worse than Harry had expected. His friend sat pressed against a tree trunk, his arms wrapped around his knees, and his face pale with something that went beyond normal fear. Harry realized with a sick feeling that this was probably the first time since infancy that Neville had been in the presence of active Death Eaters, and the psychological impact was clearly overwhelming. "They're not looking for us," Harry said quietly, moving to sit beside his friend in what he hoped was a comforting gesture. "This is just chaos. Random cruelty." "It's not random," Neville replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's a message. They're showing everyone that they're still out there, still dangerous, still willing to hurt innocent people." Before Harry could respond, a new sound cut through the night air, a voice speaking an incantation in a language that made Harry's scar prickle with recognition. High above the campsite, a massive skull appeared in the sky, its mouth open to release a serpent that writhed through the air with malevolent life. The dark mark, Voldemort's symbol, hung like a green scar against the star-filled darkness. The effect on the fleeing crowd was immediate and devastating. The screaming intensified, and even some of the ministry officials who had arrived to restore order seemed shaken by the appearance of the mark that had terrorized the wizarding world for so many years. For Neville, the sight of Voldemort's symbol was catastrophic. He collapsed entirely, his breathing shallow and rapid as a full panic attack overwhelmed his ability to process what was happening around them. "Neville," Harry said urgently, gripping his friend's shoulders and trying to ground him in the present moment. "Look at me. You're safe. We're safe. It's just a mark in the sky. It can't hurt you." But even as he spoke the words, Harry knew they weren't entirely true. The dark mark might not be able to cause physical harm, but its psychological impact on someone who had suffered as much as Neville had was profound and undeniable. It took nearly an hour for the immediate crisis to pass, and another hour beyond that for Neville to recover enough to speak coherently. By the time they were reunited with the adult members of their group, dawn was beginning to break over a campsite that looked like a war zone. The mark, Mr. Weasley explained, as they gathered their belongings and prepared to return home, was cast by someone using Harry Potter's wand. The revelation that Harry's wand had been stolen and used to cast Voldemort's symbol added another layer of violation to an already traumatic experience. But what troubled Harry most was the understanding that came with hindsight. The entire night had been designed to send a message, and that message was clearly intended for Neville as much as for the general wizarding population. The Death Eaters might not have been looking for the boy who lived specifically, but they had certainly wanted him to know that they were still active, still dangerous, and still committed to their master's cause. The return to Hogwarts for their 4th year felt different from previous arrivals, marked by an undercurrent of tension that had nothing to do with normal academic anxiety. The events at the World Cup had reminded everyone that the wizarding world remained a dangerous place, and even the familiar comfort of the castle felt somewhat diminished by the knowledge of what lurked beyond its protective wards. The opening feast proceeded normally, until Professor Dumbledore rose to make what was clearly an announcement of unusual importance. The ancient headmaster's blue eyes held their familiar twinkle, but there was also something more serious in his expression as he addressed the assembled students. "I have the honor to announce," Dumbledore said, his voice carrying easily through the suddenly silent Great Hall, "that Hogwarts will be hosting a very special event this year. The Triwizard Tournament will be taking place at our school." The hall erupted in excited chatter as students turned to each other with expressions of wonder and speculation. Harry had heard of the tournament, of course, a legendary competition between the 3 greatest wizarding schools in Europe that had been discontinued decades earlier due to its dangerous nature. "For those unfamiliar with the tournament's history," Dumbledore continued once the noise had subsided, "it involves 3 tasks spread throughout the school year, which will test the champions in many different ways. The schools of Beauxbatons and Durmstrang will be joining us here at Hogwarts, and from each school, a single champion will be selected to compete." Harry noticed that Neville had gone very still beside him, his face pale as he processed the implications of what Dumbledore was announcing. "Due to the dangerous nature of the tournament tasks," the headmaster continued, "we have decided to impose an age restriction on entrance. Only students who are of age, 17 years or older, will be permitted to put forward their names for consideration." The announcement was met with groans of disappointment from the younger students, but Harry felt only relief. The last thing Neville needed was another dangerous challenge, another opportunity for people to place impossible expectations on his shoulders. The arrival of the Beauxbatons and Durmstrang students a month later was a spectacle that reminded everyone of the international significance of the tournament they were about to witness. The French students arrived in a carriage pulled by winged horses the size of elephants, while their Durmstrang counterparts emerged from a ship that rose from the depths of the Great Lake like something from a fairy tale. Harry found himself studying the visiting students with interest, trying to identify potential champions among their ranks. From Beauxbatons, a girl named Fleur Delacour stood out, tall, beautiful, and carrying herself with the kind of confidence that suggested exceptional magical ability. From Durmstrang, Victor Krum was the obvious choice, both because of his Quidditch fame and because of the way the other students deferred to his leadership. The selection ceremony itself was held in the Great Hall, with the Goblet of Fire positioned on a pedestal where every student could see its dancing blue flames. Harry watched with fascination as older students from all 3 schools submitted their names, each piece of parchment disappearing into the goblet with a brief flare of magical energy. "Nervous?" Harry asked Neville as they watched Cedric Diggory submit his name with a confident smile. "About what?" Neville replied, though his attention seemed focused entirely on the goblet. "I'm not old enough to enter." It was a reasonable response, but something in Neville's tone made Harry uneasy. His friend had been quieter than usual since the announcement of the tournament, and Harry had noticed him spending increasing amounts of time in the library, researching topics that seemed only tangentially related to their coursework. The selection took place the following evening, with all 3 schools gathered in the Great Hall to witness the goblet's choices. The flames turned red, and sparks began to fly, signaling that the decision-making process was complete. "The champion for Durmstrang," Dumbledore announced, as the first piece of parchment emerged from the goblet, "Victor Krum." The Durmstrang students erupted in cheers as Krum rose from his seat and made his way toward the staff table, where he disappeared through a door that led to what was presumably a champion's meeting room. "The champion for Beauxbatons," Dumbledore continued, as a second piece of parchment appeared, "Fleur Delacour." Again, cheers filled the hall as the beautiful French student glided toward the same door, her perfect composure never wavering, despite what must have been tremendous internal excitement. "The champion for Hogwarts," Dumbledore said, unfolding the third piece of parchment, "Cedric Digg." But his words were cut off as the goblet flared again, more violently than before, and a fourth piece of parchment shot out of the flames. Harry felt ice settle in his stomach as he watched Dumbledore catch the unexpected parchment and unfold it with hands that seemed to shake slightly. "Neville Longbottom," the headmaster read in a voice that carried clearly through the suddenly silent hall. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Every eye in the Great Hall turned toward where Neville sat at the Gryffindor table, his face white with shock and his hands trembling as he stared at the piece of parchment in Dumbledore's hands. "Neville Longbottom," Dumbledore called again, his voice carrying a note of command that cut through the boy's apparent paralysis. Harry watched his friend stand on unsteady legs and make his way toward the staff table, every step observed by hundreds of students who were whispering among themselves about how the boy who lived had somehow gotten his name into the goblet despite being underage. "He didn't," Harry said loudly, standing up at the Gryffindor table and facing the crowd of students who were already beginning to voice their accusations. "Neville didn't put his name in the goblet. Someone else did it." The conviction in Harry's voice was absolute, born of years of friendship and the certain knowledge that Neville would never have entered such a competition voluntarily. But even as he defended his friend, Harry felt dread settling in his chest as he realized that if someone had manipulated the goblet to select Neville, it meant that forces far more dangerous than simple competition were at work. The meeting that followed in the champions' room was tense and fraught with accusation. Representatives from Beauxbatons and Durmstrang protested the irregularity of having 2 Hogwarts champions, while ministry officials argued about the magical binding nature of the goblet selection. "The Goblet of Fire constitutes a binding magical contract, Mr. Crouch explained in his bureaucratic monotone. "Mr. Longbottom is obligated to compete regardless of how his name came to be selected." "He's 14 years old," Professor McGonagall protested, her Scottish accent more pronounced than usual in her anger. "This is completely inappropriate." "Nevertheless," Crouch replied, "the magic is binding. He must compete." Harry stood beside Neville throughout the entire discussion, offering silent support as his friend struggled to process what was happening to him. The tournament was dangerous enough for adult wizards. Asking a 14-year-old to compete against opponents 3 years older with far more magical training was almost certainly a death sentence. "Someone wanted this to happen," Harry said, as they finally returned to Gryffindor Tower late that night, surrounded by a crowd of curious and excited housemates who peppered Neville with questions he couldn't answer. "Someone specifically wanted you in the tournament." "But why?" Neville asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What could anyone gain from forcing me to compete?" Harry didn't have an answer, but he suspected that when they found out, they wouldn't like what they learned. The following weeks passed in a blur of unwanted attention and mounting pressure as the wizarding world focused its collective gaze on the unexpected fourth champion. Rita Skeeter, a reporter from the Daily Prophet, seemed particularly interested in Neville's story, conducting interviews that somehow transformed his reluctant responses into sensational headlines about the boy who lived's desperate hunger for fame and glory. "She's making it sound like you wanted this," Hermione said indignantly as she read the latest article, which suggested that Neville had somehow manipulated the goblet himself in order to gain additional recognition. "Anyone who knows you would realize how ridiculous that is." "Anyone who knows me isn't reading these articles," Neville replied, with the weary acceptance of someone who had grown used to being misrepresented in the press. "And the people who are reading them want to believe that I'm either a glory-seeking fraud or a tragic figure who's in over his head." Harry found himself taking on an increasingly protective role as the tournament progressed, running interference with reporters and overeager fans, while also trying to help Neville prepare for challenges that were designed to test the limits of adult magical ability. The first task was announced a week before it was scheduled to take place. "Dragons. Dragons," Neville repeated numbly as they sat in the library, surrounded by every book about dragon behavior and defensive magic that Hermione had been able to locate. "They want me to fight a dragon." "You don't have to fight it," Harry said, though his voice carried less conviction than he would have liked. "The task is to retrieve something the dragon is guarding, not to kill the creature itself." "Right," Neville replied with dark humor. "I just have to get past a 60-foot magical predator that breathes fire and has claws like sword blades. Much easier." Harry had never felt more helpless in his life. His friend was being forced to face mortal danger for reasons they didn't understand, and there was nothing Harry could do except offer research assistance and moral support. It was Dobby who provided the solution, appearing in their dormitory the night before the first task, with the same desperate loyalty he had shown when warning them about the Chamber of Secrets. "Dobby has come to help the great Neville Longbottom," the house elf declared, his enormous eyes filled with tears of determination. "Dobby knows what Neville Longbottom must do to survive the dragon." The advice was simple, but potentially life-saving. Gillyweed, a magical plant that would allow Neville to breathe underwater for up to an hour. It wasn't directly useful for fighting a dragon, but it might provide an unexpected advantage if the task involved water in some way. "Thank you, Dobby," Neville said solemnly, accepting the slimy plant material with hands that barely trembled. "I won't forget this kindness." The first task itself was a nightmare that Harry would remember for the rest of his life. Watching his friend face a Hungarian horntail, the most dangerous dragon in existence, while armed with nothing but a wand and his own courage, was almost unbearable. But Neville surprised everyone, including himself, with his performance. Instead of attempting to overpower the dragon or engage in direct combat, he used his knowledge of magical plants to create a smokescreen that confused the creature's senses, allowing him to retrieve the golden egg while avoiding the worst of the horntail's attacks. "That was brilliant," Harry said, as he helped his friend to the medical tent after the task, Neville's robes singed but his body intact. "Absolutely brilliant." "I was terrified the entire time," Neville admitted, accepting a vial of burned paste from Madame Pumphrey. "I thought I was going to die." "But you didn't," Hermione pointed out with fierce pride. "You found a way to succeed without compromising who you are. That's what real courage looks like." The success of the first task brought new challenges in the form of increased media attention and social obligations that Neville found even more daunting than facing the dragon. The Yule Ball, a traditional part of the tournament, required him to find a dance partner and navigate the complex social politics that came with being a champion. "I can't ask anyone," Neville said miserably, as the ball approached, and his lack of a date became a source of increasing anxiety. "Everyone either wants to use me for publicity, or they're too intimidated to say yes." "What about Ginny?" Harry suggested. "She's always been friendly, and she's not the type to be interested in publicity." "Ginny Weasley." Neville's face brightened slightly at the suggestion. "Do you think she'd say yes?" As it turned out, Ginny was delighted to be asked, and the Yule Ball became one of the few pleasant experiences of Neville's tournament year. Watching his friend dance with genuine joy and laugh at Ginny's clever conversation, Harry felt a moment of pure happiness that temporarily overshadowed his concerns about the challenges that lay ahead. The second task was announced in February, and the nature of the challenge filled Harry with a dread that went far deeper than anything he had felt about the dragons. "We will be taking something that you'll sorely miss," Professor McGonagall explained to the champions during the pre-task briefing. "You will have 1 hour to retrieve it from the depths of the Great Lake." Harry realized with horrible certainty what the task would involve even before the details were announced. The gillyweed that Dobby had provided suddenly made perfect sense. Neville would need to breathe underwater for an extended period to complete this challenge, but it was what the task would require him to retrieve that made Harry's blood run cold. "The hostages have been selected based on their importance to each champion," Professor McGonagall continued. "Miss Delacour's sister, Mr. Crumb's friend, Mr. Diggory's girlfriend, and for Mr. Longbottom." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Harry already knew that he would be spending the next several hours unconscious at the bottom of the Great Lake, waiting for his best friend to risk his life in an attempt to save him. "I won't do it," Neville said, when they had a moment alone to discuss the task. "I won't let you be put in danger because of this stupid tournament." "You have to," Harry replied firmly. "The magic is binding, remember? And besides, I'll be perfectly safe. The organizers wouldn't let anything actually happen to the hostages." It was a reasonable argument, but Harry could see that Neville wasn't convinced. His friend's protective instincts were warring with his obligations as a champion, and the internal conflict was clearly tearing him apart. The morning of the second task, Harry submitted to the sleeping charm that would keep him unconscious during his time underwater, but not before making Neville promise to be careful and not take any unnecessary risks. "Just get me and get out," Harry said, as the magical sleep began to take hold. "Don't try to be a hero. Just complete the task and survive." What Harry didn't learn until much later was how his words had affected his friend's approach to the challenge. Neville didn't just complete the second task, he exceeded every expectation and requirement, diving far deeper than necessary to ensure that not only Harry, but all the other hostages were safely retrieved. "He stayed underwater for nearly 2 hours, Hermione told Harry excitedly, as he recovered from the magical sleep in the medical tent. Far longer than anyone expected, and he made sure that everyone got back safely. The judges were amazed by his dedication. Harry felt a complex mixture of pride and worry at the news. Pride because his friend had shown extraordinary courage and compassion, but worry because the same protective instincts that had driven Neville to save everyone might lead him into even greater danger in the future. The third task was scheduled for June, and as the date approached, Harry found himself consumed by a growing sense of unease that went far beyond normal anxiety about his friend's safety. The entire tournament had felt wrong from the beginning, too convenient, too perfectly designed to put Neville in increasingly dangerous situations. "Someone's been manipulating events," Harry said during one of their strategy sessions in the library. "The dragon, the lake, now the maze. Each task has been specifically designed to test different aspects of your abilities." "What are you suggesting?" Neville asked, though his voice suggested he had been thinking along similar lines. "I'm suggesting that whoever entered your name in the goblet has been working behind the scenes to ensure that you reach the final task," Harry replied, And that means the maze isn't going to be just another challenge. It's going to be a trap. The realization that the entire tournament might be an elaborate setup designed to harm Neville made Harry more determined than ever to find a way to protect his friend. But with the binding magical contract in place and the international attention focused on Hogwarts, there was no way to withdraw from the competition without potentially catastrophic consequences. It was during their final preparation session, 2 days before the third task, that Harry made a decision that would change everything. "I'm coming with you," he announced, as they practiced defensive spells in an empty classroom. "What do you mean?" Neville asked, though his expression suggested he already understood what Harry was proposing. "The maze. I'm coming with you into the maze." Harry's voice was calm but absolutely determined. "There has to be a way to get me inside without the judges knowing." "Harry, that's insane," Hermione protested. "If you're caught, you could be expelled. Both of you could be expelled." "If I don't go with him, he could be killed," Harry replied simply, "and that's not acceptable." The plan they developed was dangerous and complicated, involving a disillusionment charm that would render Harry invisible to casual observation and careful timing that would allow him to enter the maze immediately behind Neville without being detected by the judges or spectators. "Are you sure about this?" Neville asked, as they prepared to put their plan into action. "You're risking everything to help me." "I'm risking everything to keep my best friend alive," Harry corrected. "There's no decision to make." The third task began at sunset, with the 4 champions entering the maze at staggered intervals based on their performance in the previous challenges. Neville, who had scored highest overall, went first, followed immediately by Harry under his disillusionment charm. The maze was everything Harry had feared it would be, a nightmare landscape filled with creatures and magical traps designed to test every aspect of a wizard's training and resolve. They faced boggarts that took the form of their deepest fears, acromantula that attacked with venomous fangs, and dead ends that seemed to shift and change when they weren't being directly observed. But they faced them together, just as they had faced every challenge since their first meeting on the Hogwarts Express. When Neville's courage faltered, Harry was there to encourage him. When Harry's tactical thinking proved insufficient, Neville's growing confidence and magical ability carried them forward. They were within sight of the Triwizard Cup when disaster struck. The cup itself was clearly a portkey. Harry could see the telltale shimmer around its edges that indicated transportation magic. But it was too late to turn back, and with the sounds of pursuit behind them, there was no choice but to move forward. "Together," Neville said, as they approached the cup, his hand reaching out to touch the magical artifact at the same time as Harry's. The familiar sensation of portkey travel gripped them both, and Harry felt the maze dissolve around them as they were transported to a destination that filled him with immediate dread. They landed in a graveyard that reeked of death and dark magic, surrounded by ancient headstones that cast twisted shadows in the moonlight. And waiting for them, with a smile that contained no warmth whatsoever, was Peter Pettigrew. "Welcome, Neville Longbottom," Pettigrew said with malicious satisfaction. "My master has been so looking forward to meeting you again." Before either boy could react, Pettigrew had drawn his wand and cast a curse that sent Cedric Diggory, who had apparently reached the cup first, crashing to the ground in a lifeless heap. "Kill the spare," came a high, cold voice from a bundle of robes that Pettigrew carried. "We only need the boy." Harry felt horror wash over him as he realized that they had walked directly into Voldemort's trap, and that their friendship, the thing that had always been their greatest strength, might finally have led them into a situation they couldn't survive. But even as Pettigrew raised his wand toward Harry's heart, Neville stepped protectively in front of his friend, his own wand already drawn, and his round face set with desperate determination. "No," Neville said firmly. "If you want him, you'll have to go through me first." It was the voice of someone who had finally, completely accepted the role that fate had thrust upon him, not because he wanted power or glory, but because the people he loved needed him to be brave. And in that moment, facing certain death in a graveyard far from help or hope, Harry Potter knew that he had never been prouder to call someone his friend. The boy who lived was ready to face his destiny, and Harry would be standing beside him when he did. Whatever darkness awaited them, they would face it together. Just as they always had. The graveyard was everything Harry had imagined the domain of death would be. Ancient headstones leaning at impossible angles, withered trees that looked like arthritic hands reaching toward a starless sky, and an atmosphere so thick with dark magic that it made breathing feel like drowning. The portkey had deposited them in the center of this nightmare landscape, with Cedric Diggory's lifeless body crumpled beside them, and Peter Pettigrew advancing with his wand raised and his watery eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. "At last," Pettigrew said, his voice carrying a satisfaction that made Harry's skin crawl. Lord Voldemort's greatest enemy, delivered exactly as promised. Harry felt Neville go rigid beside him, and he could see his friend's scar beginning to burn bright red against his pale forehead. The connection between Neville and Voldemort, whatever dark magic bound them together, was clearly stronger here in this place of death and resurrection. "Where is he?" Neville asked, his voice steadier than Harry had expected, given the circumstances. "Where's Voldemort?" Pettigrew's smile widened, revealing yellowed teeth that spoke of years spent as a rat. "Closer than you might think, boy. Much closer." He gestured toward a large cauldron that stood near the center of the graveyard, its contents bubbling with a liquid that glowed with sickly green light. Steam rose from the surface in patterns that seemed to form faces, screaming faces that dissolved and reformed in an endless cycle of torment. "Bone of the Father, unknowingly given," Pettigrew chanted, throwing a handful of grave dirt into the cauldron. The liquid hissed and turned silver, and Harry realized with growing horror that they were witnessing some kind of resurrection ritual. "Flesh of the servant, willingly sacrificed," Pettigrew continued, raising a silver knife and cutting off his own right hand with a motion so casual it suggested he had done this before. Blood sprayed across the ancient headstones as the severed hand dropped into the cauldron, and the liquid turned to gold. "And blood of the enemy," Pettigrew said, advancing on Neville with the bloody knife held high. "Forcibly taken." Harry threw himself between Pettigrew and his friend without conscious thought, earning a backhanded blow that sent him sprawling across the graveyard's uneven ground. But the distraction was enough for Neville to draw his wand and point it directly at Pettigrew's heart. "Stay back," Neville warned, his voice carrying a note of command that surprised even Harry. "I've killed before, Pettigrew. I'll do it again if I have to." "Brave words from a frightened child," Pettigrew sneered, but Harry noticed that he didn't advance any closer to Neville's wand. "But you forget. You're bound by the tournament magic. You cannot harm me while the binding remains active." Before Neville could test that assertion, Pettigrew flicked his own wand, sending a cutting curse that opened a gash across Neville's forearm. Blood welled from the wound and began to flow toward the cauldron, as if drawn by invisible strings. "Blood of the enemy, forcibly taken," Pettigrew completed, his voice rising to a triumphant shout as Neville's blood hit the golden liquid. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The cauldron erupted in flames that burned without heat, but filled the graveyard with light so bright it made the ancient headstones look like they were carved from bone. The liquid inside began to boil furiously, sending up clouds of steam that coalesced into the shape of a man. Tall, thin, and pale as death itself, Lord Voldemort rose from the cauldron like a nightmare given flesh. His red eyes fixed immediately on Neville, and his lipless mouth stretched into what might have been a smile if it hadn't been so completely devoid of human warmth. "Neville Longbottom," Voldemort said, his voice high and cold and filled with a satisfaction that made Harry's blood freeze. "The boy who lived. How gratifying to see you again." Harry had heard stories about Voldemort's appearance, had seen his face in the diary and in the back of Quirrell's head. but nothing had prepared him for the reality of the Dark Lord's physical presence. This was evil incarnate, not the passionate cruelty of someone who had chosen darkness, but the cold malevolence of someone who had surrendered his humanity so completely that only the shell of a man remained. "You're ugly," Neville said quietly, and Harry felt a surge of admiration for his friend's refusal to be intimidated. "Uglier than I expected." Voldemort's laugh was like breaking glass. Still defiant. "Good. I would hate for our reunion to be anticlimactic." He gestured with one pale hand, and suddenly the graveyard was filled with the sound of apparition as dozens of hooded figures materialized among the headstones. Death Eaters, Harry realized with growing dread. Voldemort's most devoted followers, answering their master's summons. "My friends," Voldemort said, his red eyes sweeping across the assembled figures with obvious satisfaction. 13 years it has been, and yet here you stand before me, as though it were only yesterday. How touching." One of the Death Eaters stepped forward, his mask removed to reveal a face that Harry recognized from wanted posters in the Daily Prophet. Lucius Malfoy, his pale hair gleaming in the magical light from the cauldron. "My lord," Malfoy said, dropping to one knee with practiced subservience. "We have awaited your return with eagerness." "Have you?" Voldemort's voice carried a note of amusement that was somehow more frightening than outright anger. "How curious. I seem to recall that very few of you made any effort to find me during my absence." The assembled Death Eaters shifted uncomfortably, and Harry realized that this reunion was not going to be the celebration they had probably expected. "But we are not here to discuss the past," Voldemort continued, his attention returning to Neville. "We are here to correct a mistake that has haunted me for 14 years. He raised his wand, Harry's wand, stolen during the Quidditch World Cup, and pointed it directly at Neville's chest. "Do you know, boy, why you survived that night?" Voldemort asked conversationally. "Do you understand the magic that saved your miserable life?" "Love," Neville replied without hesitation, his round face set with determination, despite the terror Harry could see in his brown eyes. "My mother's love." "Love," Voldemort repeated, as if the word tasted foul in his mouth. "Such a common explanation for what is actually quite complex magic. Your mother did indeed die to save you, but her sacrifice created more than simple protection." Harry felt dread settling in his chest as he realized that Voldemort was building toward some revelation that would change everything they thought they understood about that night. "She created a connection," Voldemort continued, his red eyes fixed on Neville's scar. "A link between us that has persisted all these years. Every time you have faced me, you have grown stronger. Every time I have tried to kill you, the bond has deepened." "What are you saying?" Harry asked, unable to remain silent despite the danger. Voldemort's attention shifted to him with obvious amusement. "Ah, Harry Potter, the loyal friend. How touching that you chose to accompany young Neville to his death." "He's not going to die," Harry said firmly, moving to stand beside his friend, despite the wands pointed in their direction. "I won't let him." "You won't let him?" Voldemort's laugh was like the sound of breaking bones. "Dear boy, you are a 14-year-old child facing the most powerful dark wizard who has ever lived. What exactly do you think you can do to stop me?" Before Harry could respond, Voldemort flicked his wand almost casually. "Crucio." The Cruciatus curse hit Harry like a bolt of liquid fire, sending him to his knees as every nerve in his body screamed in agony. He had never experienced pain like this, not just physical torment, but a suffering that seemed to tear at his very soul. But even through the haze of torture, Harry could hear Neville shouting his name, could see his friend trying to reach him, despite the Death Eaters who blocked his path. "Stop!" Neville yelled, his voice breaking with desperation. "Let him go! Your fight is with me!" Voldemort lifted the curse, and Harry collapsed to the graveyard's cold earth, his body still twitching with residual pain. "How noble," Voldemort observed with mock appreciation. "But I think we can do better than that. Crucio." This time the curse was aimed at Neville, who fell beside Harry with a scream that cut through the night air like a blade. Harry forced himself to move, despite the lingering effects of his own torture, crawling toward his friend and trying to shield him from the worst of the magical assault. The gesture was futile. He had no way to block the unforgivable curse, but it seemed to surprise Voldemort enough that he lifted the spell after only a few seconds. "Fascinating," the Dark Lord murmured, studying them both with the detached interest of someone examining particularly interesting insects. "Even in the face of certain death, you choose loyalty over self-preservation. How very Gryffindor of you." Harry helped Neville to his feet, both of them shaking from the effects of the Cruciatus curse, but still standing together against the circle of Death Eaters that surrounded them. "Now," Voldemort continued, raising his wand with deliberate ceremony, "we shall see whether love is truly stronger than death. Avada Ked." The incantation was never completed. As Voldemort began to cast the killing curse, Neville raised his own wand in desperate defense, and something extraordinary happened. The two wands connected. A golden thread of light stretched between them, growing brighter and more substantial with each passing second. The air around them began to shimmer with magical energy, so intense that several of the Death Eaters took involuntary steps backward. "Priori incantatem," one of them whispered, his voice filled with awe and terror. "The wands, they share a core." Harry watched in fascination and growing hope as the golden connection between the wands began to pulse with power that seemed to come from some source beyond normal magic. This was something ancient and primal, a force that predated the casual cruelties of the modern wizarding world. Slowly, shapes began to emerge from the golden light, translucent figures that moved with the purposeful grace of people who had important business to complete. The first was Cedric Diggory, his young face marked by confusion and sorrow as he looked around the graveyard that had become his grave. "Tell my parents," he said to Harry, his voice carrying clearly despite its ethereal quality. "Tell them I love them." More figures followed, victims of Voldemort's wand, each emerging from the golden light with messages of love or warnings about dangers yet to come. An old man Harry didn't recognize, a woman who might have been a ministry worker, others whose faces spoke of lives cut short by dark magic. And then, finally, the figures Harry had been hoping and dreading to see. Frank Longbottom stepped from the golden light with the confident bearing of an aura who had never backed down from a fight. His face was kind, but determined, and his eyes found Neville immediately with an expression of fierce parental pride. "My son," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. "My brave, wonderful son." Beside him came Alice Longbottom, her red hair catching the magical light as she smiled at Neville with the kind of love that transcends death itself. "We're so proud of you," Alice said, moving to stand protectively near her son, despite her translucent state. "So very proud of the man you've become." "Mum," Neville whispered, tears streaming down his face as he looked at parents he had never been able to remember. "Dad, you have to hold the connection," Frank said urgently, his attention shifting between Neville and the increasingly agitated Voldemort. "Keep the spell active as long as you can. We can't maintain this for long." Two more figures emerged from the light, and Harry's breath caught in his throat as he recognized James and Lily Potter, their faces exactly as he remembered them from photographs, but somehow more real, more present than any picture could ever be. "Harry," Lily said, her green eyes, so identical to his own, filled with love and pride. "My darling boy." "You're not supposed to be here," James added, but his voice carried affection rather than reproach. "This isn't your fight." "Yes, it is," Harry replied firmly, never taking his eyes off his parents' faces. "Neville is my best friend. His fights are my fights. That's what makes you a hero, Lily said softly. Not power or fame or destiny, but the choice to stand beside the people you love when they need you most. The ghostly figures began to move, forming a protective circle around Harry and Neville that seemed to push back against the Death Eater's attempts to interfere with the magical connection. Now, Frank said urgently, when I give the signal, break the connection and run for the portkey. We'll hold them as long as we can. Harry looked at the Triwizard Cup, which lay gleaming among the headstones where it had fallen when they first arrived. It seemed impossibly far away, especially with dozens of Death Eaters blocking their path. Ready? Alice asked, her translucent form beginning to flicker as the spell that maintained the connection started to weaken. Neville nodded, his face set with the kind of determination that Harry had learned to recognize as his friend preparing to do something incredibly brave and possibly suicidal. Now, Frank shouted. Neville broke the wand connection with a sharp downward movement, and immediately the ghostly figures surged forward, their ethereal forms somehow solid enough to interfere with the Death Eater's attempts to cast curses. The graveyard erupted in chaos as Voldemort's followers found themselves grappling with spirits who fought with the desperation of parents protecting their children. Harry and Neville ran. It was perhaps 50 yards to the Triwizard Cup, but it felt like miles as they dodged curses and leaped over ancient headstones that crumbled under the impact of misfired spells. Behind them, Harry could hear Voldemort's high, cold voice shouting orders to his followers, his fury at being thwarted evident in every syllable. They were perhaps 10 yards from the cup when a killing curse missed Harry's head by inches, close enough that he could feel the cold touch of death magic against his skin. 5 yards when Neville stumbled, his leg caught by a tripping jinx that sent him sprawling across the graveyard's uneven ground. Harry didn't hesitate. He grabbed his friend's arm and hauled him to his feet, half carrying and half dragging him the final distance to the portkey. Their hands touched the cup's handles simultaneously, and Harry felt the familiar sensation of portkey travel grip them both, pulling them away from the graveyard and Voldemort's rage. They landed in a tangle of limbs and robes on the soft grass outside Hogwarts' Great Hall, with the sounds of the tournament celebration still echoing from within the castle. For a moment, Harry couldn't quite process the contrast. They had gone from facing certain death to the cheerful noise of students enjoying themselves, and the transition felt surreal. Then Neville collapsed. His friend's body went completely limp, his face grey and his breathing shallow. The scar on his forehead was still burning bright red, and Harry realized with growing panic that whatever connection existed between Neville and Voldemort was still active, still causing damage. "Help!" Harry shouted, his voice carrying across the castle grounds with desperate urgency. "Someone help us!" The celebration inside the Great Hall stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of running footsteps and urgent voices. Professor Dumbledore was the first to reach them, his blue eyes taking in the scene with the kind of instant comprehension that came from decades of experience with dark magic. "Get him to the hospital wing," Dumbledore commanded, his usual gentle demeanor replaced by the authoritative presence of someone who had fought in 2 wars against Voldemort. Immediately. Harry refused to be separated from Neville during the journey to the hospital wing, and he remained at his friend's bedside as Madame Pomfrey worked to stabilize his condition. The school nurse's face was grim as she ran diagnostic spells over Neville's unconscious form, and Harry could see genuine fear in her usually confident expression. "The scar," she murmured to Dumbledore, who had remained in the hospital wing despite the crowds of people demanding his attention. "It's like nothing I've ever seen. The magical scarring goes deeper than the physical mark. It's affecting his entire magical core." "A connection formed through shared pain," Dumbledore said quietly, his eyes fixed on Neville's still face, "and now strengthened by shared blood." The implications of that statement made Harry feel sick. Voldemort had used Neville's blood in his resurrection ritual, creating some kind of permanent link between them that went beyond the original connection formed during Neville's infancy. "Will he recover?" Harry asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I believe so, Dumbledore replied, though his tone carried more hope than certainty. Neville is stronger than he knows, and he has something that Voldemort can never truly understand or overcome. What? Love, Dumbledore said simply. Not just his mother's sacrifice, but the love of friends who choose to stand beside him, regardless of the cost. That kind of magic is more powerful than anything Tom Riddle ever learned. It took 3 days for Neville to regain consciousness, 3 days during which Harry maintained a constant vigil beside his friend's bed, despite the protests of teachers, nurses, and ministry officials who wanted to question him about the events in the graveyard. When Neville's eyes finally opened, the first thing he saw was Harry's worried face, leaning over him with an expression of relief, so profound it was almost painful to witness. "You stayed," Neville said softly, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Of course I stayed," Harry replied, as if there had never been any other option. "Where else would I be?" The days that followed were a blur of debriefings, interrogations, and increasingly heated arguments between Dumbledore and the ministry officials who refused to believe that Voldemort had truly returned. Cornelius Fudge, in particular, seemed determined to dismiss their account as the product of trauma-induced delusion. "The boy is clearly disturbed by his ordeal," Fudge insisted, during one particularly frustrating meeting in the hospital wing. "Children often create elaborate fantasies to cope with traumatic experiences." "The boy's name is Neville Longbottom," Harry said sharply, his patience with the minister's dismissive attitude finally exhausted. "And he's telling you the truth about what happened." "Mr. Potter," Fudge replied with the kind of condescending tone adults used when they wanted to dismiss inconvenient truths, "I understand your desire to support your friend, but nothing," Harry interrupted, rising from his chair beside Neville's bed, with anger radiating from every line of his body. "Voldemort is back. He killed Cedric Diggory right in front of us. He tortured both of us with the Cruciatus Curse. And instead of preparing for war, you're sitting here calling us liars." The confrontation escalated from there, with ministry officials threatening consequences for Harry's insubordination, while Dumbledore quietly began implementing security measures that suggested he, at least, believed their account of Voldemort's return. It was during one of these tense meetings that James and Lily Potter arrived at Hogwarts, their faces set with the kind of parental fury that transcended normal human emotion. "Our son nearly died protecting his friend," Lily said to Fudge, her voice deadly quiet in a way that made the minister take an involuntary step backward. "And you're treating him like a criminal for telling you the truth." "Mrs. Potter," Fudge began, but James cut him off with a gesture that brooked no argument. "We're taking Harry home," James announced. "Both boys, actually, if Augusta agrees. They've been through enough." "That won't be necessary," Harry said, before anyone else could respond. "I'm staying." His parents turned to look at him with expressions of surprise and growing concern. "Harry," Lily said gently, "you don't have to prove anything to anyone. You've already done more than enough." "This isn't about proving anything," Harry replied, his attention shifting to Neville, who was listening to the conversation with obvious anxiety. "This is about being where I need to be." "Voldemort is back," James pointed out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had fought the Dark Lord before. "The safest place for you is at home, with your family." "No," Harry said firmly, his decision crystallizing as he spoke. "The safest place for me is with Neville. We're stronger together than we are apart." He turned to face his friend, whose brown eyes were wide with something that looked like hope and fear in equal measure. "If you'll have me," Harry continued, "I want to stay and fight beside you. Whatever comes next, whatever Voldemort has planned, I want to face it together." Neville was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with the implications of Harry's offer. Accepting his friend's loyalty meant accepting responsibility for his safety, and Harry could see the weight of that burden settling on his shoulders. "Are you sure?" Neville asked finally. "This is my destiny, my fight. You don't have to make it yours." "I already have," Harry replied simply. "The moment I chose your friendship over everything else, I made it my fight too." The hospital wing fell silent as everyone present processed the significance of what they were witnessing. Two 14-year-old boys making a choice that would define not just their own futures, but the fate of the entire wizarding world. "Very well," Dumbledore said finally, his blue eyes twinkling with something that might have been pride or sorrow or both. "But if you're going to stay and fight, you'll need training. Both of you. The war that's coming will require more than courage and loyalty. It will require skill, strategy, and allies." "Then we'll learn," Neville said, his voice stronger than it had been since his return from the graveyard. "Whatever it takes." Harry reached out and clasped his friend's hand, feeling the warmth of human connection that had sustained them through every challenge they had faced together. "Together," Harry said, his voice carrying the weight of an unbreakable vow. "Together," Neville agreed. And in that moment, their bond was sealed in a way that no dark magic could ever break. Outside the hospital wing, the wizarding world continued its stubborn refusal to acknowledge the return of Lord Voldemort. The Daily Prophet published articles dismissing Neville's account as attention-seeking fantasy, while ministry officials worked to suppress any evidence that might contradict their preferred narrative of continued peace and safety. But within the walls of Hogwarts, preparations for war had already begun. Dumbledore moved with quiet efficiency to re-establish old alliances and forge new ones, while trusted teachers began developing advanced defensive curricula that would prepare students for the reality of magical combat. And in the hospital wing, two boys who had chosen each other over safety, over family, over the easier path of denial and retreat, began to plan for a future that would demand everything they had to give. The boy who lived and his most loyal friend united against the darkness that was coming, whether the world was ready for it or not. Voldemort had returned to physical form, stronger and more dangerous than ever before, but he had also ensured that his greatest enemy would not face him alone. The war for the wizarding world was about to begin, and its outcome would depend not on prophecy or destiny or magical power, but on the unbreakable bond between two friends who had chosen love over fear, loyalty over self-preservation, and each other over everything else the world might offer. Whatever came next, they would face it together, just as they always had, just as they always would. The summer that followed Voldemort's return was unlike any Harry had ever experienced, not just because of the constant vigilance and security measures that now governed their daily lives, but because of the way it reshaped every relationship and assumption that had previously defined his understanding of the wizarding world. The boy who lived was no longer a symbol of past victory, but a target for future conflict, and Harry Potter was no longer just a supportive friend, but a recognized hero in his own right. The transformation had begun even before they left Hogwarts for the holidays. Word of Harry's decision to stay and fight alongside Neville had spread throughout the castle with the kind of speed that only truly significant news could achieve, and the response had been overwhelming in its support and admiration. Students who had previously seen Harry as merely Neville's loyal sidekick began to understand that loyalty itself could be a form of heroism as profound as any magical power. "You could have gone home," Terry Boot said during one of their final meals in the Great Hall, his voice carrying a respect that Harry had never heard directed toward him before. "Your parents wanted to keep you safe, and no one would have blamed you for choosing family over everything else." "Neville is family," Harry replied simply, the truth of that statement as clear to him as his own name. Not by blood, but by choice. And sometimes the families we choose are more important than the ones we're born into. The conversation had taken place at the Ravenclaw table, where students from all four houses had begun gathering around Harry and Neville during meals, not to gawk at the boy who lived's fame, but to express their support for what both boys had endured and their commitment to the fight ahead. Even some of the Slytherins, led by Daphne Greengrass and a few other students whose families had suffered under Death Eater influence, had approached them with quiet offers of alliance that spoke to the seriousness of the situation. "Things are going to be different now," Hermione observed as they packed their belongings for the journey home. "Not just between you two, but for everyone. Voldemort's return changes everything." She was right, of course. The wizarding world was slowly, reluctantly beginning to accept that the peace they had enjoyed for 14 years was over, and that the next phase of their lives would be defined by conflict rather than the comfortable routines of normal existence. Even the Ministry, despite Fudge's continued denials, was quietly implementing security measures that suggested they understood the magnitude of the threat they faced. But for Harry, the most significant change was not external, but internal. The recognition that his identity was no longer defined solely by his relationship to Neville, but by his own choices and actions in support of what he believed was right. "The Prophet wants to interview you," Neville said, as they made their way toward the Hogwarts Express for what felt like the most momentous train journey of their lives. "About your decision to stay, about what it means to choose friendship over safety. Let them interview both of us," Harry replied. "This isn't my story or your story, it's our story, and it should be told that way." The train journey itself was subdued compared to their usual end-of-year celebrations, marked by the kind of serious conversations that teenagers shouldn't have to have, but that circumstances had forced upon them. Students discussed security arrangements for the summer holidays, shared information about family members who were joining the Reformed Order of the Phoenix, and made plans that acknowledged the possibility that some of them might not return to Hogwarts in September. "My dad's teaching me advanced defensive magic," Dean Thomas said, during one particularly sobering conversation in their compartment. "Says that if you know who really is back, we're all going to need to know how to protect ourselves." "Mine too," Seamus Finnegan added, "and he's setting up safe houses for Muggle-born families who might need to disappear quickly." Harry listened to these discussions with a growing sense of responsibility that went beyond his personal commitment to Neville. These were his classmates, his fellow students, people whose lives would be shaped by the war that was coming, whether they wanted to be involved or not. And increasingly, he found that they were looking to him and Neville not just as symbols, but as leaders who might help them navigate the dangers ahead. The platform at King's Cross was crowded with parents, whose faces reflected the same mixture of pride and terror that Harry had seen in his own mother and father. Families were holding each other closer than usual, and the usual excitement about summer plans had been replaced by urgent conversations about safety protocols and emergency procedures. James and Lily Potter were waiting near the barrier between platforms, their expressions serious but determined. Beside them stood Augusta Longbottom, whose usually stern demeanor had been softened by something that looked like wonder as she watched her grandson disembark from the train, with the confident bearing of someone who had faced the worst the world could offer and survived. "Neville," Augusta said, as her grandson approached, her voice carrying a warmth that Harry had rarely heard from her before. "You look different." "I feel different, Gran," Neville replied honestly. "I feel like I finally understand who I'm supposed to be." Augusta's eyes filled with tears that she made no effort to hide. "You've become the man your parents always knew you could be. They would be so proud." The reunion between the families was emotional, but brief, overshadowed by the urgent need to discuss security arrangements and future plans. It was clear that both the Potters and Augusta had been in extensive communication with Dumbledore and other Order members about how to keep the boys safe while still allowing them the freedom they would need to prepare for the challenges ahead. "We've made arrangements," James said, as they gathered in a quiet corner of the station. "Both families will be spending the summer at Longbottom Manor. The estate has some of the strongest protective wards in Britain, and it will allow us to coordinate our efforts more effectively." Harry felt a surge of gratitude toward his parents for understanding that separating him from Neville was not an option, and toward Augusta for opening her home to guests during what was undoubtedly one of the most stressful periods of her life. "There's something else," Lily added, her green eyes serious as she looked between the two boys. "Dumbledore wants to begin your training immediately. Advanced defensive magic, tactical planning, the kind of preparation that you shouldn't need at 14, but that circumstances require." The summer that followed was unlike anything Harry had ever experienced. Longbottom Manor proved to be a sprawling estate that seemed to exist partially outside normal space, its ancient walls incorporating magical protections that had been refined and strengthened over centuries of careful stewardship. The house itself felt alive, in a way that reminded Harry of Hogwarts, with corridors that rearranged themselves according to need, and rooms that seemed to expand or contract based on the number of people using them. But it was the people who filled the manor that made the summer truly extraordinary. In addition to the Potter and Longbottom families, the house became a gathering place for members of the Reformed Order of the Phoenix, creating an atmosphere that combined the urgency of a military headquarters with the warmth of an extended family gathering. Remus Lupin arrived during their second week, carrying advanced textbooks on defensive magic and wearing an expression of grim determination that reminded Harry of their darkest moments during third year. Sirius Black followed shortly afterward, his appearance much improved from his time as a fugitive, but his manner still carrying the restless energy of someone who had spent too long running from forces beyond his control. "You boys ready for some serious learning?" Sirius asked during their first formal training session, his grey eyes twinkling with something that might have been mischief if the circumstances hadn't been so grave. "Because what we're going to teach you makes normal defense against the dark arts look like a children's game." The training was indeed unlike anything they had experienced at Hogwarts, where their school lessons had focused on theory and basic application. This was practical combat magic, designed to keep them alive in situations where their opponents would be trying to kill them. They learned to cast defensive spells while moving, to fight multiple opponents simultaneously, and to use their environment as both weapon and shield. But perhaps more importantly, they learned to fight together. "Your greatest strength," Lupin explained during one particularly intense session, "is not your individual magical ability, though that's considerable. It's your ability to anticipate each other's actions and coordinate your responses. That kind of partnership is rare, even among trained auras." Harry found himself amazed by how naturally he and Neville complemented each other in combat situations. Where Neville's newfound confidence made him willing to take risks and press attacks, Harry's tactical thinking helped them avoid unnecessary dangers and exploit their opponent's weaknesses. Where Harry's loyalty sometimes led him to take on more than he could handle, Neville's protective instincts helped keep them both focused on achievable objectives. "It's like watching a single fighter with 4 arms and 2 brains," Sirius observed, after a particularly impressive demonstration of coordinated spellcasting. "I've never seen anything like it." The training was complemented by academic work that went far beyond anything they might have encountered in a normal summer. Hermione, who had been invited to join them for several weeks, threw herself into research projects that explored the magical theory behind the bond that connected Harry and Neville, while also investigating historical precedents for their situation. "There are references," she announced during one of their evening study sessions, "to similar partnerships throughout wizarding history. Warriors who are stronger together than apart, friends whose loyalty transcended normal magical limitations." "What happened to them?" Harry asked, though he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to know the answer. "Most died in battle," Hermione admitted with characteristic honesty. "But the ones who survived, they changed the world. They ended wars, reformed governments, established institutions that lasted for centuries." The implication that their friendship might be part of some larger historical pattern was both inspiring and terrifying. Harry had never aspired to change the world. He had simply wanted to stand beside his friend through whatever challenges they faced. But increasingly, it seemed that those challenges would require them to take on responsibilities that went far beyond personal loyalty. It was during one of these study sessions that they received an unexpected visitor. Ron Weasley arrived at Longbottom Manor, looking older than his 15 years, his freckled face marked by the kind of seriousness that suggested he had been thinking deeply about the choices that lay ahead. "I want to help," Ron announced without preamble, his blue eyes fixed on Neville with an intensity that reminded Harry of their friend's chess-playing focus. "With the training, with whatever you're planning, I want to be part of it." The conversation that followed was difficult but necessary, exploring the reality that joining their cause would mean accepting risks that no teenager should have to face. Ron listened with growing determination as they explained the dangers involved, the likelihood that some of them wouldn't survive the war that was coming, and the certainty that there would be no normal teenage years for anyone who chose to fight. "You think I don't know that?" Ron asked finally, his voice carrying a note of frustration that suggested he had been having similar conversations with his own family. "You think I haven't been paying attention to what's happening?" "We know you understand the risks," Neville said gently. "But understanding them and living with them are different things." "Then help me learn to live with them," Ron replied simply. "Help me learn to be the kind of friend you both deserve." It was a request that neither Harry nor Neville could refuse, and Ron's integration into their training regimen marked another evolution in the relationships that would define the war ahead. Where Harry's loyalty to Neville was absolute and unwavering, Ron brought a different kind of support, practical, strategic, and grounded in a deep understanding of wizarding culture and family dynamics. "We're building something," Hermione observed, as they watched Ron master a particularly complex defensive sequence. "Not just preparing for war, but creating a new kind of alliance, a new way of thinking about friendship and loyalty, and what it means to fight for something larger than yourself." The summer also brought visits from other members of their extended Hogwarts family, each adding their own perspective and skills to the growing community that had formed around Harry and Neville's partnership. Ginny Weasley arrived for 2 weeks in July, her quiet strength and practical magic complementing the more aggressive training that dominated their daily schedules. Luna Lovegood spent several days at the manor, her unique perspective on magic and reality providing insights that none of them had considered. "You're connected," Luna said, during one particularly memorable conversation, her dreamy voice carrying its usual note of absolute certainty. "Not just to each other, but to something larger. The magic that flows between you is part of a pattern that stretches back through history and forward into futures that haven't been written yet." Harry had learned to take Luna's observations seriously, even when they seemed to make no immediate sense. Her ability to see connections that others missed had proven valuable too many times to dismiss, and her comments about patterns and futures left him wondering what forces might be guiding their choices in ways they didn't fully understand. But it was a conversation with Dumbledore during one of the headmaster's visits to the manor that provided the most significant revelation about the nature of their bond. "I have spent a considerable time," Dumbledore said, as they sat in Augusta's study, surrounded by books that chronicled centuries of Longbottom family history, "researching the magical theory that underlies your friendship, and I believe I have discovered something that you should understand." He paused, his blue eyes twinkling with the combination of wisdom and sadness that Harry had learned to associate with the headmaster's most important pronouncements. The prophecy that marked Neville as the boy who lived spoke of power that the Dark Lord knows not, Dumbledore continued. "I had always assumed that this referred to love, specifically the protection his mother's sacrifice provided. But I now believe the prophecy was more complex than that." Harry felt his heart rate increase as he realized that Dumbledore was about to reveal something that would change their understanding of everything they had experienced together. "The power that Voldemort cannot understand," Dumbledore said quietly, "is not just love, but loyalty freely given. The magic that flows between you two is not simply friendship, but a bond forged through sacrifice and choice that creates strength neither of you could achieve alone." "What does that mean?" Neville asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It means," Dumbledore replied, "that the prophecy was never about one person defeating Voldemort. It was about two people working together, creating something that dark magic cannot overcome or corrupt." The implications of that revelation were staggering. Harry had always assumed that his role was to support Neville as the chosen one fulfilled his destiny. But if Dumbledore was correct, then Harry's loyalty and choice were not just helpful additions to Neville's power, they were essential components of the magic that would ultimately defeat Voldemort. "Neither of you can complete this task alone," Dumbledore continued, his gaze moving between them with obvious fondness. "But together, you represent something that Tom Riddle has never understood and never will understand. The power that comes from choosing to stand beside someone else, not for personal gain, but out of genuine love." That night, Harry lay awake in the comfortable guest room that had become his home, away from home, staring at the ceiling and thinking about prophecies and destiny and the weight of expectations that he had never asked for, but seemed unable to escape. Through the wall that separated their rooms, he could hear Neville moving restlessly, clearly struggling with similar thoughts. "Can't sleep either?" Harry asked quietly, knowing that his friend would hear him through the thin walls. "Too much to think about," Neville replied, his voice carrying clearly in the Manor's nighttime silence. "If Dumbledore is right, then everything we've been through has been leading to this moment." "Does it change anything?" Harry asked. "Knowing that your destiny includes me?" There was a long pause before Neville answered, and Harry could imagine his friend's serious face as he considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "It makes it feel less lonely," Neville said finally. "And it makes me understand why I could never quite imagine facing Voldemort by myself. Some things are too big for one person to handle." "Even the boy who lived?" "Especially the boy who lived," Neville replied with a soft laugh. "I think maybe that was the point all along. To teach me that being chosen doesn't mean being alone." As the summer progressed, their training intensified, and their understanding of the magical bond between them deepened. They learned to cast complementary spells that amplified each other's power, to share magical energy during extended combat, and to anticipate each other's actions with an accuracy that bordered on telepathy. But perhaps more importantly, they learned to think strategically about the war that was coming, not just as individual fighters, but as leaders who would need to inspire and coordinate others in the fight against Voldemort's growing influence. "The Death Eaters have organization and experience," Sirius explained during one of their tactical planning sessions, "but they also have weaknesses that come from serving a master who rules through fear rather than loyalty. That gives us opportunities if we're smart about how we use them." The final weeks of summer were marked by a series of meetings that brought together the core members of what was becoming known as Dumbledore's Army, not just the adult members of the Order of the Phoenix, but the younger generation who would be taking on increasingly important roles in the conflict ahead. Harry found himself amazed by the diversity of the group that had formed around their central partnership, from former classmates like Dean Thomas and Seamus Finnegan to surprising additions like Neville's cousin Alice, named for his mother, and several older students who had graduated but chose to remain involved. "We're not just fighting for ourselves," Harry said, during one particularly memorable gathering in the Manor's Great Hall. "We're fighting for the kind of world we want to live in, one where friendship matters more than power, where loyalty is valued more than fear, and where people choose to stand together instead of allowing themselves to be divided by hatred." The response to his impromptu speech was overwhelming, and Harry realized with some surprise that he had become as much of a symbol to their allies as Neville himself. Not the boy who lived, but something equally important, the friend who had chosen love over safety, loyalty over personal advancement, and courage over the easier path of staying safely in the background. As August drew to a close, Harry and Neville found themselves preparing for their return to Hogwarts with a mixture of excitement and apprehension that reflected their new understanding of their roles in the conflict ahead. They were no longer simply students going back to school, but leaders returning to what had become a crucial stronghold in the war against Voldemort. "Things will be different this year," Neville observed, as they packed their belongings for the journey back to school. "Not just because we know what we're facing, but because everyone else knows too." "Good different or bad different?" Harry asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Both," Neville replied honestly. "Good because we won't have to pretend that everything is normal when it isn't. Bad because normal teenage life is essentially over for all of us." On their final night at Longbottom Manor, they participated in a tradition that Augusta suggested, and that seemed to capture the significance of everything they had experienced together. Each of them wrote a letter to their future selves, to be opened only after Voldemort's final defeat, capturing their thoughts and feelings at this crucial moment in their lives. Harry's letter was longer than he had expected, filled with reflections on friendship and loyalty and the amazing journey that had brought him to this point. But the final paragraph captured what he most wanted his future self to remember. "I want you to know that every choice I made was worth it. Every moment of fear, every sacrifice, every time I chose Neville's safety over my own. It was all worth it. Not because we won or lost, but because we faced it together. Because I learned that the most important thing in life is not what you accomplish for yourself, but what you're willing to give for the people you love. I hope you never forget that, even when the war is over and normal life returns. I hope you never forget what it felt like to be part of something larger than yourself." Neville's letter was shorter, but no less profound, and when they exchanged them briefly before sealing them away, Harry was moved by his friend's simple but powerful words. "Whatever happens, I want you to remember that you were never alone." From the moment we met on the Hogwarts Express, through every challenge and every victory, you had people who believed in you, not because of what you survived as a baby, but because of who you chose to become as a person. That's the real magic, not prophecy or destiny or power, but the choice to be worthy of the love people offer you. The journey back to Hogwarts for their 5th year was markedly different from any of their previous trips. The train was full of students whose summer experiences had aged them beyond their years, and conversations that should have focused on classes and Quidditch instead dealt with security measures and evacuation plans. But for Harry, the most significant change was not external, but internal. As the Hogwarts Express pulled into Hogsmeade Station and the familiar castle came into view across the lake, he felt a sense of homecoming that went beyond simple nostalgia. This was where their story had begun, where they had first chosen each other over easier alternatives, where they had learned what it meant to be truly loyal friends. "Ready?" Neville asked, as they gathered their belongings and prepared to disembark. "Ready," Harry replied, and realized that for the first time in his life he truly meant it. They had started as children on a train, two lonely boys who had found in each other the friendship they both desperately needed. Now they were something more, partners, allies, and leaders whose bond had become legendary among their peers, and whose choices would shape the outcome of the war ahead. The boy who lived, and his most loyal friend, walking together toward a castle that would soon become the final battleground in their conflict with Lord Voldemort. But whatever challenges awaited them within those ancient walls, whatever darkness Lord Voldemort might unleash in his quest for immortality and power, they would face it as they had faced everything else, together. The platform was crowded with students whose excited chatter spoke of new beginnings and fresh starts, but Harry heard something different in their voices now, a note of determination that suggested they understood the significance of the year ahead. These were not just teenagers returning to school, but young adults preparing to take their places in a war that would define the rest of their lives. As they walked through the barrier between platforms and the magic of Hogwarts began to work its familiar welcome on their hearts, Harry felt the weight of prophecy and destiny and expectation settle around them like a cloak. But it was a weight made bearable by the presence of the friend walking beside him, whose loyalty had never wavered, and whose courage had grown stronger with every challenge they had faced together. The train whistle blew, long and clear across the platform, calling all students aboard for another year of learning and growth and discovery. But for Harry Potter and Neville Longbottom, it was also a call to something far more significant. The beginning of the final chapter, in a story that had started with two lonely children choosing friendship over solitude, and would end with two heroes choosing love over fear. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Just as they always had. Just as they always would. The boy who lived, and the friend who had chosen to live beside him, united against whatever darkness the world might offer, ready to discover whether love and loyalty could truly triumph over hatred and fear. Their greatest adventure was just beginning.